You can hold the spotter scope, Grandma. Try not to drop it. The insult hung in the dry, salty air of the Coronado Island firing range, sharp and condescending. The group of younger SEAL candidates, all mountains of muscle and sun-bleached confidence, let out a collective snicker. In the center of their circle stood Catherine Sullivan, a woman whose late 40s were etched in the fine lines around her eyes and the subtle streaks of gray at her temples. Lieutenant Commander Scott Blackwood, the source of the mockery, stood tall and chiseled, radiating an aura of absolute certainty in his own superiority. He was the class leader, and he saw Sullivan not as a fellow service member but as a bureaucratic obstacle. In his mind, she was a Renf rear echelon mother figure, a relic from an older, slower military who was only on his range to sign off on ammunition expenditure reports. What Blackwood and his acolytes couldn't know was that Chief Warrant Officer 5 Catherine Sullivan was on the range under deep cover. Her assignment: evaluate the effectiveness of the SEAL Sniper Training Program, a program she herself had designed a decade earlier. Her administrative role provided the perfect camouflage, allowing her to observe without alerting the candidates that they were being assessed by one of the most lethal long-range specialists in military history. Sullivan was a ghost in their world of vibrant, aggressive youth. Dressed in a standard-issue uniform that seemed a size too big, her presence as muted as her expression. She offered no retort, no flicker of anger at the blatant disrespect. Her response was a quiet, deliberate action. She reached down and picked up the heavy, high-powered Leupold Mark 5 HD spotting scope. Her hands were steady, her movements economical. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. She braced it against the tripod with a practiced grace that utterly contradicted the administrative role they had assigned to her. But someone was watching across the range. Master Sergeant James O'Neill, a man who had seen 4 decades of war, narrowed his eyes. He saw it. He saw the way her feet were planted, a perfect, balanced foundation. He saw the way her fingers moved over the focus knob, not searching, but knowing. It was the posture of a shooter, not a clerk. He saw the subtle shift in her gaze as she scanned the distant targets, her eyes absorbing the shifting air currents that distorted the horizon, the subtle dance of dust devils that revealed the wind's invisible patterns. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. They thought she was a nobody. He was suddenly terrified. She was a legend. Blackwood continued his performance, projecting his voice so the whole group could hear his lesson. He pointed downrange at the complex target array, a simulated village bristling with hidden threats, and began a pompous lecture on the advanced ballistics required for the final test. He spoke of wind shear, the Coriolis effect, and spin drift with the air of a high priest revealing sacred mysteries. "This isn't something you learn from a book, ma'am," he said, the honorific dripping with sarcasm as he gestured vaguely in Sullivan's direction. "This takes talent, instinct." His acolytes, the younger SEALs, nodded in fervent agreement, their loyalty pledged to his charisma. They created a wall of indifference around her, talking over and around her as if she were a piece of equipment, their complicit silence isolating her more effectively than any direct insult. But Catherine Sullivan was not in their world. She was in a world of her own, a silent space defined by observation and calculation. She ignored the noise, the posturing, the arrogant pronouncements. Her entire being was focused downrange, using senses honed through decades of practice to read the environment in ways no technology could match. She felt the subtle shifts in air pressure against her skin, noticed the way certain plants bent in response to air currents, cataloged the behavior of heat mirages as they warped the distant targets. Blackwood, for all his technical knowledge, was still dependent on his equipment, still a prisoner of numbers and readouts. Sullivan had transcended that limitation long ago. She had become something more elemental, a living extension of the physics that governed a bullet's flight. The harsh Iraqi sun beat down on the desert floor, creating waves of heat that distorted the landscape. In the distance, a small convoy of 3 Humvees moved slowly through the barren terrain, the Delta Force operators inside scanning for threats. They were 20 miles behind enemy lines, tracking intelligence on a high-value Republican Guard commander. Catherine Sullivan, barely 17 years old, adjusted her position on the rocky outcrop. She was not supposed to be here, not officially, but her father, Colonel William Sullivan, had pulled strings to have her assigned as a special observer to the forward command post. A half-mile away from the convoy, she lay prone, her body melded with the earth, the Remington M24 sniper rifle an extension of her being. Through her scope, she could see Lieutenant Frank O'Neill, future Master Sergeant O'Neill, leading the patrol, his movements cautious but confident. She had been ordered to maintain position and radio if she spotted any hostile movement. Nothing more. The ambush came with shocking speed. RPG fire erupted from a hidden wadi, the first rocket striking the lead Humvee with devastating precision. The vehicle lurched, smoke billowing from its engine compartment. Machine gun fire raked the convoy, pinning the Americans down. O'Neill dove for cover, but Catherine could see he'd taken shrapnel to his left leg. Blood darkened his desert fatigues. She counted at least 12 attackers, all carrying Soviet-made AK-47s. Their leader, distinguished by his red keffiyeh, directed the assault with sharp hand gestures. The Americans returned fire, but they were outnumbered and in an exposed position. Catherine's radio crackled. "Sullivan, report. It was Captain Matthews from the command post. Ambush in progress. Delta team pinned down. 12 plus tangos. Lieutenant O'Neill wounded. Hold position. QRF is scrambling. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Catherine knew they wouldn't last 5. She dialed in her scope, measuring the distance 870 yards. The wind was gusting from the west at approximately 12 mph. She calculated the bullet drop and windage instinctively, the numbers flowing through her mind like water. She knew she should wait. She was an observer, not an operator. But as she watched another RPG launch toward the disabled Humvee, something cold and certain settled in her chest. 5 shots in quick succession, each one finding its mark with brutal efficiency. The RPG gunner, the machine gunner, 3 more fighters who had exposed themselves momentarily. Their bodies crumpled to the desert floor like puppets with cut strings. The remaining attackers froze, confusion evident in their frantic movements. The man with the red keffiyeh shouted orders, trying to reorganize, trying to locate the source of the unexpected death, raining down upon them. Catherine exhaled slowly, centered her crosshairs on the red fabric, and squeezed the trigger. At 870 yards, the bullet took 1.2 seconds to reach its target. The leader's head snapped back, a fine mist of red hanging briefly in the still desert air. The surviving attackers broke and ran, panic overriding discipline. When the quick reaction force arrived 18 minutes later, they found the Delta team alive, wounded, but stable. Lieutenant O'Neill, despite the shrapnel in his leg, had organized a defensive perimeter around the damaged Humvees. "Who took those shots?" the QRF commander asked, scanning the ridgelines. O'Neill's eyes narrowed against the sun. "Don't know, sir. Must have been our guardian angel." Later, when Catherine was debriefed, her father stood silently in the corner of the tent, his face unreadable. The intelligence officers were skeptical that a 17-year-old girl, even one with her training, could make those shots under combat conditions. 6 targets, 6 kills at 870 yards with a 12 mph crosswind. The senior officer repeated, disbelief evident in his voice. Colonel Sullivan finally spoke. "She's a Sullivan. as if that explained everything. And for those who knew, it did. The Sullivan Ranch in Montana sprawled across 2,000 acres of rolling grassland and pine-covered hills. It was here, far from prying eyes, that Catherine had received her real education. She was 8 years old the first time her father put a rifle in her hands, a custom-made .22 with a walnut stock polished to a deep honey glow. It was winter, the Montana landscape buried under 3 feet of snow, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. Shooting isn't about strength, Colonel William Sullivan had told her, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. It's about stillness. Find the space between heartbeats. That's where the shot lives. William Sullivan was a legend in certain circles, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones in the corridors of Langley and the Pentagon. During the Cold War, he had been one of America's premier long-range shooters, with confirmed eliminations across 3 continents. He had helped design the modern sniper training program used by both the Marines and the Army. But to Catherine, he was simply Dad, a quiet, methodical man who demanded excellence in all things. On the gun range behind their house, he had set up a series of steel targets at varying distances. The farthest was positioned at exactly 1,000 yards, a seemingly impossible distance for an 8-year-old with a .22 rifle. But William Sullivan did not believe in limitations. "Breathe," he instructed, his hand steady on her shoulder. "See the bullet's path before you send it. The wind, the distance, the drop. They're all just math. And math doesn't care how old you are or whether you're a boy or a girl." By the time she was 12, Catherine could consistently hit targets at 600 yards with a .308 Winchester. By 14, she had developed a preternatural sensitivity to environmental conditions that influenced a bullet's flight. William would blindfold her and have her describe wind patterns solely from the sensations against her skin, the sounds around her, and the subtle scents carried on the air, an ability that would later make her seemingly supernatural behind a rifle. Their house was a testament to the Sullivan family's military heritage. 3 generations of service were displayed on the walls, from her grandfather, who had served with distinction in the 5th Special Forces Group, to her father's career in classified operations, to the beginnings of her own journey. "The rifle is just a tool," William often repeated, a mantra that formed the core of his philosophy. "The shooter is the weapon. Remember that." Catherine's mother had died when she was 4, cancer swift and merciless. In the vacuum left by her absence, the bond between father and daughter had grown unusually strong. William raised her not as a daughter, but as an heir, the next carrier of the Sullivan legacy. "There will come a time," he told her on her 16th birthday, "when someone will underestimate you because you're a woman. That's when you'll have the advantage. Never correct their mistake until you're looking through your scope." At the Coronado firing range, Catherine Sullivan stood quietly as Lieutenant Commander Blackwood continued his lecture, unaware of the predator in his midst. Master Sergeant O'Neill approached, his weathered face impassive, but his eyes alert. "Chief Warrant Officer Sullivan," he said loud enough for the others to hear, "it's an honor to have you on our range today." Blackwood paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features at the interruption. O'Neill continued, ignoring the lieutenant commander. "If I'm not mistaken, you served with Task Force 88 in Afghanistan, ma'am." A silence fell over the group of SEALs. Task Force 88 was a classified Joint Special Operations unit, its very existence officially denied. Catherine's eyes met O'Neill's, recognition dawning. "It was a long time ago, Master Sergeant." "Not that long, ma'am. I believe we crossed paths in '02, Hindu Kush Mountains." O'Neill's voice carried weight, heavy with shared history. Blackwood's expression shifted from annoyance to confusion, then to the first stirrings of doubt. Master Sergeant, we're in the middle of a briefing. Begging your pardon, sir. O'Neill interrupted, his tone respectful but firm. But I believe Chief Sullivan might have some valuable insights on the ghost scenario you're about to run, given that she designed it. The younger SEALs exchanged glances, uncertainty replacing their earlier confidence. Blackwood stood straighter, his jaw tightening. That can't be right. The ghost scenario was developed by a DevGru sniper instructor, a guy named Sullivan. The realization hit him as the name left his lips. Catherine's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her eyes, a predator's focus coming into sharp relief. "Would you like me to continue observing, Lieutenant Commander?" she asked quietly. "Or would you prefer I take a more active role in today's exercise?" The mountains of the Hindu Kush were ancient and unforgiving, a landscape of sharp peaks and hidden valleys where empires had bled and died for centuries. In the pre-dawn darkness, SEAL Team 6 moved silently through a narrow ravine, their objective a Taliban command post nestled in a village 2 miles ahead. Lieutenant Commander Michael Harrison led from the front, his night vision goggles revealing the terrain in shades of ghostly green. Behind him, 7 operators moved like shadows, their weapons at the ready, their breathing controlled and even. What they didn't know, what intelligence had failed to inform them, was that their approach had been compromised. 3 miles away, in a stone house converted into a communications center, a Taliban commander named Fazul Rahman watched thermal imaging feeds supplied by their Pakistani allies. The Americans were walking into a trap. "All teams in position," Rahman spoke into a radio. "Wait for them to enter the killing zone." 30 fighters armed with RPGs and heavy machine guns waited in carefully concealed positions around the village. The narrow valley the SEALs were traversing would become a shooting gallery. Catherine Sullivan lay prone on a rocky outcrop. 200 meters from the village, her M40A3 sniper rifle steady against her shoulder. She was not officially part of the SEAL team. Women were still prohibited from direct combat roles. On paper, she was listed as a special technical advisor attached to a support unit. In reality, she was there because Colonel Richardson, the task force commander, knew her capabilities and had specifically requested her. Through her night vision scope, she observed the Taliban fighters taking their positions. She counted at least 30 of them, far more than intelligence had suggested. The SEALs were outnumbered 4-1 and walking into a perfectly executed ambush. Her spotter, Staff Sergeant Miller, whispered, "Jesus Christ, it's a trap. We need to warn Harrison." "Comms are down," Catherine replied, her voice perfectly calm. "They're using jammers." "Then what do we do? They'll be slaughtered." Catherine made minute adjustments to her scope, analyzing every variable that would affect her shots. At 200 meters in the variable conditions of these mountains, each shot would require a complete recalculation of a dozen factors. The bullet would drop approximately 29 feet over that distance. The fluctuating wind patterns would push it several feet laterally. Even the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, would significantly impact accuracy at this extreme range. "We changed the equation," she said simply. Her first shot struck Rahman in the center of his forehead, killing him instantly. Before his body hit the floor, Catherine had already adjusted her aim and fired again, eliminating the communications operator beside him. The Taliban fighters, suddenly leaderless, fell into confusion. Catherine methodically worked her way through their positions, prioritizing the RPG gunners and machine gun teams. Each shot required an entirely fresh assessment of the environment, sensing minute changes in wind temperature and barometric pressure that would alter the bullet's flight. 12 shots, 12 kills. By the time the SEAL team reached the village, the remaining Taliban fighters had fled, believing they were under attack by a much larger force. Harrison secured the objective, puzzled by their good fortune, until a radio message from the command center cleared the confusion. "Overwatcher reports all clear," came the transmission. "You can thank Ghost 7 for saving your asses." Later, when Harrison debriefed with Colonel Richardson, he asked about the mysterious Ghost 7. "A resource we're lucky to have," Richardson replied cryptically. "But officially, Lieutenant Commander, this operation was a success due to solid intelligence and the skill of your team, nothing more." "Understood." Harrison nodded, military discipline overriding his curiosity. But he never forgot the call sign Ghost 7. The Pentagon's policy was clear and unyielding. Women were excluded from direct combat roles, particularly in special operations units. This barrier had stood for decades, supported by tradition, institutional inertia, and genuine concerns about physical capabilities and unit cohesion. Catherine Sullivan had encountered this wall at every turn in her career. Despite her exceptional marksmanship, despite her proven ability under fire, despite her perfect scores in every technical aspect of combat shooting, the answer was always the same. That's not a role for women. Her unique status as a Chief Warrant Officer 5, the highest warrant officer rank in the military and one reserved for technical specialists with extraordinary expertise, was both a blessing and a curse. It acknowledged her unparalleled skills while simultaneously keeping her outside the traditional command structure. It was the military's compromise, giving her the authority her abilities demanded while avoiding the precedent of placing a woman in direct combat leadership. After Afghanistan, she had been quietly assigned to Fort Benning as an instructor at the U.S. Army Sniper School, a position that acknowledged her skills but kept her away from combat operations. It was a gilded cage, prestigious but limiting. Colonel Richard Collins, the commander of the school, had welcomed her with mixed emotions. "Your record speaks for itself, Sullivan," he had said during their first meeting. "But I'll be honest, there are instructors here who won't accept you no matter what you've done." "I'm used to that, sir," she had replied. "I'm sure you are. But here's the thing, I don't care what they think. I care about turning out the best snipers in the world. If you can help me do that, you have my full support." And she had excelled, transforming the long-range shooting curriculum and introducing new techniques for wind reading and environmental assessment that dramatically improved student performance. The results were undeniable, but the resistance remained. Captain Frank Mitchell, a former Force Recon Marine with 20 years of service, had been particularly vocal in his opposition. "Shooting targets is one thing," he argued during a staff meeting. "Combat is another world entirely. No offense to the chief, but there's a reason women aren't in direct combat roles." Catherine had weathered such comments with outward calm, though each one struck like a physical blow. She did not argue or defend herself. Instead, she let her results speak for her. When the Army Marksmanship Unit held its annual competition, Catherine entered against Collins's advice. "You're painting a target on your back," he warned. "If you don't win decisively, they'll use it against you." "Then I'll win decisively," she replied. The competition drew the best shooters from across the military, Army, Marines, Air Force, and Navy. The final event was a long-range challenge, 10 shots at a moving target at 200 yards with variable wind conditions. Mitchell, who was also competing, scored 82 out of 100, an excellent result that put him in the lead. When Catherine stepped up to the firing line, a hush fell over the spectators. Some were curious, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. She emptied her mind, focusing only on the fundamentals her father had taught her decades ago. Find the space between heartbeats. Become one with the environment. 10 shots. 10 perfect hits. A score of 100 unprecedented in the competition's history. As she stood to leave the firing position, Mitchell approached her, his expression unreadable. "That was impressive," he admitted grudgingly. "Thank you, Captain. But it's still just a competition, real combat." With all due respect, she interrupted, her voice low but intense. "I've made shots under combat conditions that would turn your hair white. I've watched men die through my scope. I've made life or death decisions that no range could ever simulate." She paused, letting her words sink in. "So please spare me the lecture about real combat." Mitchell stood silent, reassessing the woman before him. Finally, he nodded once, a small gesture of newfound respect, and walked away. That evening, Colonel Collins called Catherine to his office. "Congratulations on your win," he said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "But we need to discuss your future." "Sir, I've received a request for your transfer. Apparently, someone in JSOC has been following your career with interest." Catherine's pulse quickened, but her expression remained neutral. "May I ask where I'm being transferred to?" Collins slid a folder across his desk. "It's classified. All I can tell you is that it involves a program called Valkyrie. Does that mean anything to you?" The name sent a jolt through her system. Valkyrie had been mentioned in her father's journals, a Cold War program he had helped develop. A program to train female snipers for operations where men would be too conspicuous. "It might," she answered carefully. Collins studied her face. "Whatever it is, Sullivan, it's big. The signature on those orders belongs to a 3-star general." He paused, then added, "They're finally recognizing what I've seen all along. You're not just good, you're a game changer." The crisis arrived with the anticlimactic metallic clang of a final misted shot. The last SEAL sniper team had failed. The ghost scenario. The capstone exercise of the most difficult sniper course in the world had defeated them all. Downrange, the simulated high-value target remained untouched, a steel testament to their failure. Lieutenant Commander Blackwood threw his rifle's logbook to the ground in a fit of theatrical rage, blaming the impossible wind, the subpar equipment, anything but his own team's shortcomings. Master Sergeant O'Neill's voice boomed over the loudspeaker. "Time! The exercise is a failure." A heavy pall of dejection settled over the elite operators. From the observation tower, a quiet figure descended. It was the base commander, Colonel Thomas Reynolds, a full-bird colonel whose presence commanded immediate silence. He surveyed the dejected SEALs, his gaze lingering on Blackwood's angry face, before shifting to the calm, composed figure of Chief Sullivan. Blackwood scoffed loud enough for the colonel to hear. "No point trying again, sir. The wind is a living entity today. Maybe the chief here can file a weather complaint for us." Colonel Reynolds's eyes went cold. He ignored Blackwood completely and walked directly to Sullivan. His voice was low, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "Chief," he said, "feel like showing these boys how the old guard gets it done." Catherine Sullivan didn't smile. She simply looked at the colonel and gave a single short nod. "Yes, sir." She didn't walk towards the SEAL's state-of-the-art carbon fiber sniper system. Instead, she moved to a worn-scarred Pelican case at the edge of the firing line, a case no one had even noticed. She opened it, and inside, nestled in faded foam, was an M210 enhanced sniper rifle, a heavier, older semi-automatic weapon that the young SEALs considered an obsolete relic. She assembled it with a fluid, rhythmic efficiency, each component finding its place with the certainty of muscle memory developed over thousands of repetitions. The rifle came together not as separate parts, but as a unified whole, an extension of her own body and will. In her hands, the obsolete weapon transformed into something timeless and deadly. She didn't touch the sophisticated digital wind meters the SEALs had been obsessing over. She didn't need technology to tell her what her body could sense directly. She plucked a single blade of dry grass, held it up, and watched it fall, a primitive but effective way to read the local air currents. But even this was just a supplemental confirmation of what she already knew, from feeling the air against her skin and observing the subtle movements of vegetation across the range. She settled behind the rifle, her body conforming to the earth beneath her, eliminating any separation between herself, her weapon, and the environment. She became utterly still, her breathing slowing to an almost imperceptible rhythm. Her focus narrowed to a singular point of concentration that excluded all distractions, all doubt, all ego, all unnecessary thought. Blackwood crossed his arms, a smirk fixed on his face, eagerly anticipating the public failure that would validate his entire worldview. The other SEALs exchanged skeptical glances. The wind was howling, whipping across the range in unpredictable gusts. Making one shot at that distance was a miracle. A cold bore shot with an old rifle was a fantasy. Sullivan did not fire for 30 seconds, then a full minute. She waited. She was not looking at the targets. She was watching the world around them, not just seeing it, but feeling it, becoming part of its patterns. She perceived the heat haze shimmering above the distant rocks, noticed how a far-off flag fluttered in a rhythm that revealed the wind's underlying structure, sensed the subtle changes in air pressure that signaled shifting currents. Then, for a sliver of a second that no one else perceived, the chaos subsided. A pocket of calm, a perfect fleeting corridor of still air, formed between her position and the village. It was a window that wasn't on any chart, a moment of opportunity that only someone who had transcended mere technique could recognize. In a single seamless motion that was too fast to properly track, she squeezed the trigger. It wasn't one shot. It was 7. 7 rounds left the barrel in such a rapid, controlled sequence that they sounded like a single violent tear in the fabric of the air. Thump, 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 thump. A deafening silence fell over the range, broken a second later by a chorus of impossibly distant metallic reports. Tink, 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 tink. Through the spotting scopes, a scene of impossible carnage unfolded. The HVT target was down. The 2 steel guards on the rooftop beside him were down. The driver of a moving vehicle target struck through the windshield was down. A hidden sniper in a high window, a target no one had even spotted, was down. A comms antenna on the roof was shattered. And the final shot had struck a simulated explosive charge which erupted in a puff of red smoke. An entire enemy command unit neutralized by a single shooter in less than 3 seconds. Blackwood's jaw was slack, his face a canvas of disbelief. "No," he whispered, the sound stolen by the wind. "No way. That's not possible. Nobody can read that wind. Nobody shoots like that." Colonel Reynolds walked forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He moved with a calm deliberateness, his eyes fixed on the stunned lieutenant commander. He placed a heavy hand on Blackwood's shoulder, and the younger man flinched as if struck by lightning. "Lieutenant!" The colonel's voice was dangerously quiet, yet it carried the weight of absolute authority. "You are about to learn a very important lesson about making assumptions." He turned to his aide, a young ensign who was staring at Chief Sullivan with undisguised awe. "Ensign, pull up Chief Warrant Officer Sullivan's file. Read the summary. Unclassified portions only, if you please." The ensign's hands trembled slightly as he manipulated his tablet. The screen glowed, and he began to read, his voice growing stronger and more incredulous with every word. "Name Catherine Sullivan. Rank Chief Warrant Officer 5. A few of the SEALs blinked. CW5 was the highest, most revered warrant officer rank reserved for technical masters of their craft. Unit classified formerly attached to Joint Special Operations Command Task Force. The ensign paused, swallowing hard. Task Force designation is redacted, sir. He continued, his voice now ringing with a kind of reverence. Combat deployments, 17. Combat hours over 4,000. Primary specialty, special operations, target interdiction. Secondary specialty, high-angle marksmanship instructor, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The SEALs stared, their arrogance melting away into cold shock. DevGru SEAL Team 6, the best of the best. Awards include, the ensign's voice cracked, the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device and the Distinguished Service Cross. He looked up from the tablet, his eyes wide. Sir, there's a note on her file from General... He paused, the name redacted. It says she holds the standing record for the longest confirmed kinetic strike in a combat zone. The distance is classified. A profound silence held the range captive. The information settled over the group of elite warriors like a physical weight, crushing their egos, rearranging their understanding of the world. Colonel Reynolds let the silence do its work. Before he spoke again, his voice now a low, sharp blade directed at Blackwood. Lieutenant, the reason you found this course so difficult is because Chief Sullivan designed it 10 years ago. She wrote the book. The reason the wind seems impossible is because she chose this exact firing point at this exact time of year to teach operators like you to see beyond the damn numbers on your kestrel. She is here to force you to learn the art, not just the science. He gestured to the old rifle now resting on its bipod. That M210, that's the rifle she used on a moonless night in the Hindu Kush to dismantle a command and control cell from over 200 meters away. To you, it's a museum piece. To her, it's an extension of her will. With that, the colonel turned his back on the humiliated SEALs. He faced Catherine Sullivan, who was already methodically breaking down the rifle, her work done. He drew himself up to his full height, his posture ramrod straight, and executed a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't the quick, perfunctory gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was the deep, reverent salute reserved for heroes, for legends, for recipients of the Medal of Honor. Ma'am, he said, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond military courtesy. My apologies for the ignorance displayed here today. I assure you it will be corrected. Master Sergeant O'Neill, seeing the colonel's salute, instantly snapped to attention and rendered his own. Then, one by one, like dominoes of humility, the young arrogant SEALs followed. They stood stiffly, their hands raised to their brows, their faces a mixture of shame and awe. They were no longer saluting an administrative officer. They were saluting a ghost. The story spread faster than wildfire in a dry canyon. Before the brass casings from Sullivan's rifle had even cooled, the legend of the Ghost of Coronado was already being whispered in the barracks, texted between fire bases, and spoken of in hushed, reverent tones in the bars where operators gathered. It became an instant cautionary tale within the tight-knit Naval Special Warfare community. The quiet, unassuming chief warrant officer, who had single-handedly, and with a seeming relic of a rifle, outshot an entire class of SEAL sniper candidates, wasn't a joke. She was a standard. Lieutenant Commander Blackwood's hubris became the central pillar of the lesson. The phrase, "Don't get Sullivaned," indeed, quickly entered the Special Operations lexicon, a direct and potent warning against the lethal combination of arrogance and assumption. The next morning, at 0445, Lieutenant Commander Scott Blackwood stood alone outside the nondescript administrative building where Chief Warrant Officer Sullivan worked. The pre-dawn air was heavy with salt and fog, a gray shroud that seemed appropriate for his mission of atonement. He wore his standard uniform pressed to knife-edge perfection, but there was something different about his bearing. The swagger had been replaced by a rigid formality, the arrogance erased by a night of brutal self-reflection. When Sullivan emerged at precisely 0500, Blackwood stood in her path, his posture stripped of all its former bravado. There were no excuses, no justifications. He simply stood at attention and delivered a formal, sincere apology for his words, his attitude, and his profound lack of respect. Then, in the ultimate act of surrender, he asked for her mentorship. He asked to learn. Catherine Sullivan looked at the humbled officer, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She gave a single nod. "Be on the range at 0530, she said, her voice even, "and be ready to listen to the wind." Her vindication wasn't in his apology. It was in the chance to forge a better warrior. The firing range was deserted at 0530, the targets barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. Blackwood arrived 5 minutes early, finding Sullivan already there, kneeling beside a weathered green canvas bag. She had changed from her administrative uniform into more practical attire, faded desert camouflage pants, a simple black t-shirt, and well-worn combat boots. Without the shapeless uniform, her athletic build was more apparent, her movements fluid and precise. "Leave your rifle in its case," she instructed without looking up. "You won't need it today." Blackwood frowned, but complied, setting down the hard case containing his custom Macmillan TAC-3, a state-of-the-art sniper rifle worth more than most people's cars. "With all due respect, Chief, if we're not shooting, what are we doing? Learning to listen." She stood holding what looked like a blindfold. "Put this on." For a moment, Blackwood's old pride flared a reflexive resistance to being put in such a vulnerable position. Sullivan seemed to sense his hesitation. "Yesterday, you and your team failed the ghost scenario because you trusted your equipment more than your instincts," she said matter-of-factly. "Your Kestrel wind meters told you the wind was blowing east to west at 14 miles per hour with 5% gusting. So you adjusted for that. That's standard procedure," Blackwood defended. "The wind at your position was blowing east to west," Sullivan agreed. "But 200 yards downrange it was swirling clockwise around that western hill. At 500 yards, it was actually blowing west to east because of the thermal currents rising from the valley floor. And at 800 yards near the target area, it was creating a micro-vortex effect that changed direction every 8.2 seconds. Blackwood stared at her. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I listened." She held out the blindfold again. "Your turn." For the next 2 hours, Blackwood stood blindfolded in the center of the range, while Sullivan moved silently around him, occasionally asking what he could perceive about his environment. At first, his answers were general and obvious. The temperature was rising. The wind was from the west. "Deeper," she pushed. "What else does the wind tell you?" Slowly, painfully, he began to notice subtleties he had never considered. How the air felt different when it came across water versus land. How tiny changes in pressure against his skin telegraphed shifts in direction before they fully manifested. How the sound of the wind through different materials, grass metal target frames, the nylon of his uniform, created a complex audio map of his surroundings. When she finally removed the blindfold, the sun was fully up, and Blackwood felt like he was seeing the range for the first time. Sullivan handed him a canteen of water. "The Kestrel is a tool," she said as he drank. "A good tool. But it's measuring the wind at one point in space. A bullet travels through thousands of points, each with its own conditions. The best technology in the world can't replace this." She tapped her temple. "Your onboard computer. Your instincts." Blackwood nodded, a new respect evident in his eyes. My father used to say something similar about hunting. Said you had to feel the woods, not just see them. Smart man. He was. Vietnam 3rd Marines. Died last year. Blackwood's voice carried a complex weight. Sullivan studied him for a moment. I'm sorry for your loss. He wouldn't have made the mistakes I made yesterday. Blackwood's admission was quiet but firm. No, Sullivan agreed. He probably wouldn't have, but he had to learn once, too. She began packing her gear. Same time tomorrow. Bring your rifle. We'll see if you can apply what you've started to learn. As she walked away, Blackwood called after her, Chief Sullivan, thank you. She paused, but didn't turn around. Don't thank me yet, Lieutenant. We've barely begun. Master Sergeant O'Neill found Sullivan in the officers' mess that evening, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and a stack of personnel files, the records of Blackwood's sniper class. She was making notations in precise, economical handwriting. Mind if I join you, Chief? O'Neill asked, already setting down his tray. Sullivan gestured to the empty chair across from her. Free country, Master Sergeant. O'Neill settled his bulk into the chair, his weathered face creased in a half-smile. Heard you took Blackwood out for a blindfold party this morning. Word travels fast. Too fast, she replied, closing the file she was reviewing. Is there something I can help you with, O'Neill? The Master Sergeant glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then leaned forward. Fallujah, 2004, April 7th. I was there. Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened a predator's focus coming into play. 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, O'Neill continued. We were clearing houses in the northeastern sector when everything went to hell. My squad was pinned down in a courtyard taking fire from 3 directions. Sullivan recognized the location immediately. She had been deployed on a classified mission to eliminate high-value targets in Fallujah during the same operation. Their paths had nearly crossed, though O'Neill couldn't have known it then. Then the spotter called out a suicide bomber approaching from the east alley. O'Neill continued, his voice lower. Guy was wired with enough explosives to level half the block. He paused, studying Sullivan's face. We had no line of sight. The bomber was behind 3 walls, using the buildings for cover as he approached. There was no shot. Except, somehow, there was. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. The shot came from somewhere outside the city. Went through 3 walls, and hit the bomber's center mass, detonating his vest before he could reach us. Sullivan sipped her coffee, neither confirming nor denying, though she remembered the shot with perfect clarity. It had been one of her most challenging eliminations. A shot that required understanding not just the physics of ballistic penetration through multiple barriers, but also the probable movement pattern of a target she couldn't see. The official report said it was a lucky shot from one of our rooftop positions, O'Neill continued. But I knew better. There wasn't a Marine in Fallujah who could have made that shot. But there were rumors about a special asset operating in the area. Call sign Ghost 7. The mess hall had emptied around them, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the only sound breaking the silence between them. Finally, Sullivan spoke. Why are you telling me this, Master Sergeant? Because I never got to say thank you, O'Neill replied simply. And because those men out there, Blackwood and his team, they need to understand what they're dealing with. Not just a woman in uniform. Not just an officer. But a goddamn guardian angel with a rifle. Sullivan allowed herself a small smile. I think they got the message yesterday. Maybe, O'Neill conceded. But there's knowing and there's understanding. Blackwood's a good operator. Probably the best natural shooter I've seen in years. But he's never had to make a real decision. never had to watch the consequences of pulling or not pulling that trigger. And you think I have? O'Neill's eyes were steady. I know you have. I've read between the lines of your file. 17 deployments isn't just a number. It's 17 times carrying the weight of life and death. It changes a person. Sullivan was silent for a long moment. Then she gathered her files and stood. Get some rest, Master Sergeant. Tomorrow's going to be a long day for your trainees. As she turned to leave, O'Neill asked one final question. The shot in Fallujah, what was the distance? Sullivan paused at the door, then replied without turning. 854 meters. 12 crosswind. Through 3 walls of varying thickness. It wasn't luck, O'Neill. It was mathematics and patience waiting for the exact moment when all variables aligned. But she left him sitting there, his coffee forgotten, as the full implications of what she'd done settled over him like a heavy blanket. For the next week, Sullivan worked with Blackwood daily, gradually introducing him to a completely different approach to long-range shooting. While his traditional training had emphasized technology, ballistic calculations, and standardized techniques, Sullivan taught him to merge with his environment to become, as she put it, part of the bullet's journey, not just its origin. Word spread quickly among the SEAL community. What had begun as one humbled officer seeking redemption transformed into an informal master class. Other snipers began to appear at the morning sessions, first 1 or 2, then a half dozen, then nearly 20. Sullivan accepted them all, but made it clear that Blackwood, as the first to seek her guidance, would be held to the highest standard. On the 7th day, Colonel Reynolds appeared on the range accompanied by a silver-haired civilian in an expensive but understated suit. Sullivan was in the middle of demonstrating how terrain features affected wind patterns using a small smoke grenade to make the invisible air currents visible. Reynolds waited until she finished her explanation, then approached with the civilian in tow. "Chief Sullivan, a moment of your time." She nodded to the assembled snipers to continue their practice, then stepped aside with Reynolds and the stranger. "This is Mr. Harrington from the Department of Defense," Reynolds explained. "He's interested in what you're doing here." Harrington extended his hand. "Chief, it's a pleasure. I've heard remarkable things about your methods." Sullivan shook his hand firmly but briefly. "My methods aren't remarkable, Mr. Harrington. They're just foundational, basics that have been overlooked in favor of technology." "Be that as it may," Harrington replied, "the results speak for themselves. We've been monitoring the qualification scores. Your trainees have shown a 38% improvement in complex environment shooting in just 1 week. That's unprecedented." Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but her posture shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "What exactly does the DoD want with a sniper instructor, Mr. Harrington?" Reynolds and Harrington exchanged glances, and it was Reynolds who answered. "There's a proposal being discussed at the highest levels. A new program building on the work you're doing here." "What kind of program?" Sullivan's voice was flat. "One that would formalize and expand your training methodology across all special operations sniper schools," Harrington explained. "With you as the program director." Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what about my operational status?" Another glance between the two men. "That would have to be reevaluated," Reynolds said carefully, "given your new responsibilities." Translation: they wanted to take her out of the field permanently, make her an administrator, a figurehead for a program they would ultimately control. Sullivan had seen this game before, how the system co-opted and contained threats to its established order. "I'll need time to consider it," she replied diplomatically. "Of course," Harrington smiled. "But don't take too long. The secretary is quite enthusiastic about the possibility." After they left, Sullivan returned to her class, her expression giving nothing away. But Blackwood, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, could sense a shift in her demeanor, a coiled tension that hadn't been there before. Later, as they were packing up their equipment, he ventured a question. "Everything okay with the brass, Chief?" Sullivan paused in her methodical cleaning of her rifle bolt. "Politics, Lieutenant. Nothing for you to worry about." "Didn't seem like nothing," Blackwood persisted. "Seemed like they were trying to pull you off the line." Sullivan gave him a sharp look, then relented slightly. "You're more perceptive than I gave you credit for." "I had a good teacher this week," he said with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Sullivan resumed her cleaning. "They want to turn what we're doing here into a formal program, with me behind a desk instead of behind a rifle." "Would that be so bad?" Blackwood asked. "You'd be influencing the entire special operations community, not just one class." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but there's a difference between teaching theory and demonstrating reality." She reassembled the bolt with practiced efficiency. "Besides, I didn't join up to shuffle papers and attend meetings." "Why did you join?" The question was simple but loaded. Sullivan was quiet for so long that Blackwood thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, "To serve. Same as you, same as every other person here. But how I serve, that's always been on my terms." She looked up at him, her eyes uncharacteristically open. "Some people are meant for the field, Lieutenant. I'm one of them." Blackwood nodded, understanding perfectly. "What will you do? For now, keep teaching you how not to miss." She closed her rifle case with a decisive click. "Tomorrow we move to Phase 2. Be here at 0400. It's time you learned about shooting in the dark." At 0345 the next morning, Sullivan was already at the range setting up a complex nighttime shooting scenario. The targets were thermal reactive, only visible through night vision equipment, and she had placed them at various distances ranging from 300 to 200 yards. The wind had picked up overnight, adding an additional challenge to an already difficult course of fire. She heard footsteps approaching and checked her watch, still 15 minutes before Blackwood was due to arrive. Turning, she saw not Blackwood, but Captain Frank Mitchell, the former Force Recon Marine she had bested in the Army marksmanship competition years ago. He was now, she knew, from base scuttlebutt attached to Naval Special Warfare as a liaison officer. "Captain Mitchell," she acknowledged, keeping her voice neutral. "You're up early." Mitchell's face was hard in the dim light from the range house. "Couldn't sleep. Heard there was quite the circus going on out here." "Just training, Captain." "Training," he echoed, moving closer. "That's what they're calling it. I call it undermining established protocols and creating unnecessary disruption to the training pipeline." Sullivan continued her preparations, refusing to be baited. "If improving qualification scores is disruption, then I plead guilty." "This isn't about scores." Mitchell's voice took on an edge. "This is about you trying to prove something. Again. Just like at Benning." Sullivan finally stopped what she was doing and faced him directly. "What exactly is your issue with me, Mitchell? Because it seems to go beyond professional disagreement." Mitchell's laugh was harsh. "My issue. My issue is that you're dangerous, Sullivan. Not because you're good with a rifle. Plenty of people are good with rifles. You're dangerous because you make people believe exceptions should be the rule. Meaning you're an anomaly. One woman who can shoot better than most men. But instead of accepting that you're the exception, you've spent your career trying to tear down the very standards and structures that have kept our special operations forces the best in the world." Sullivan's eyes flashed the only sign of her anger. "I've never advocated lowering standards. Ever. I've only insisted that the standards be applied equally, regardless of gender." And when the next woman can't meet those standards but points to you as proof that women belong in special operations, what then? Mitchell stepped closer, invading her space. Sullivan stood her ground, unflinching. Mitchell's hostility was personal, not just institutional, and she suddenly understood why. "This is about Kandahar, isn't it?" she said quietly. A muscle in Mitchell's jaw twitched. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do. You were the sniper team leader for Operation Copper Dune in 2011. Your team was compromised. You lost 2 men. Mitchell's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. "That operation is classified." "I know. I was there too, part of the QRF that extracted your team. What you don't know is that I argued against your mission parameters from the beginning. The insertion point was to expose the exfil route compromised. I submitted a formal objection through my chain of command, but it was overruled. Your commander was determined to proceed." She paused. "The same commander who later blamed the failure on substandard equipment rather than his own planning errors." Mitchell's face had gone pale. "How do you—" "I read the after-action report. All of it, including the redacted portions. Your men died because of command arrogance, not equipment failure. And you've been carrying that guilt ever since, channeling it into resentment against anyone who challenges the system that failed you." For a long moment, Mitchell stood frozen, the truth of her words visibly striking home. Then his expression hardened again. "You don't know me, Sullivan, and you don't belong here disrupting what works. The men in these units depend on each other completely." He continued, finding his footing again. "The bond of brotherhood is what keeps them alive." "The bond of competence is what keeps them alive," Sullivan countered, not backing down an inch. "And competence has no gender." And Mitchell shook his head. "You're not listening. It's not about whether you can shoot. It's about whether you belong. And you don't, Sullivan. You never did. You're playing a game where the stakes are men's lives." Before Sullivan could respond, another voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness. "The only one playing games here is you, Captain." Blackwood emerged from the shadows, his expression cold, with contained anger. He moved to stand beside Sullivan, a deliberate show of solidarity. "Lieutenant Commander," Mitchell nodded stiffly, "this doesn't concern you. When you accost my instructor on my range at 0:30, it absolutely concerns me," Blackwood replied. "Chief Sullivan has my complete confidence and that of every operator she's trained over the past week. Your personal vendetta has no place here." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Blackwood. You're betting your career on the wrong horse." "I'm betting my career on becoming the best operator I can be," Blackwood countered. "And right now, that means learning everything this officer has to teach." He glanced at Sullivan, then back to Mitchell. "If you have official business here, state it. Otherwise, I suggest you leave us to our training." For a tense moment, it seemed Mitchell might escalate the confrontation. Then, with a disgusted sound, he turned on his heel and stalked away into the darkness. Once he was out of earshot, Sullivan turned to Blackwood. "I didn't need your help." "I know," he replied simply. "But that's not why I stepped in. What he was saying, it was wrong. And someone needed to tell him so." Sullivan studied him, seeing something new in the young officer. "Your father would be proud," she said finally. Blackwood's expression softened slightly. "I hope so." "Then all business again. Now you mentioned something about shooting in the dark." Sullivan nodded, grateful for the return to familiar ground. "Let's get to work." The night shooting session extended well past dawn, with Sullivan pushing Blackwood and the other operators who joined them to their limits and beyond. By 0900, even the most experienced snipers were mentally and physically exhausted, but exhilarated by what they had accomplished. Shots they had previously considered impossible were now within their grasp. As the group dispersed for a few hours of much-needed rest, Colonel Reynolds approached Sullivan with a grim expression. "Chief, I need you in my office, now." The colonel's office was a model of military efficiency Spartan, organized with nothing out of place. But when Sullivan entered, she found it transformed into a secure communications center. The windows were covered, and additional electronic countermeasure devices hummed quietly in the corners. Reynolds gestured for her to take a seat, then activated a secure video link on his computer. The screen flickered, and the face of General Robert Winters appeared, the commanding officer of Joint Special Operations Command, and a man Sullivan had worked under during multiple classified operations. "Chief Sullivan," the general nodded in greeting. "Secure at your end, Colonel." "Yes, sir," Reynolds confirmed. "Room is swept and secure." "Good." Winters leaned forward, his expression grave. "Chief, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest level. Until an hour ago, I believed only 3 people in the world knew the full scope of what I'm going to share. Turns out, I was wrong." Sullivan felt a prickle of unease. "Sir." "Project Valkyrie," Winters said, simply watching her face carefully. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Sullivan hesitated. Her father's journals had mentioned it, but she had always assumed it was a Cold War relic long defunct. "I've heard of it, sir. A program from the 1960s to train female operatives for specialized roles within intelligence communities." "That was the cover story," Winters confirmed. The reality was far more specific. Valkyrie was a black program designed to identify and train female snipers for operations where male operators would be too conspicuous or in situations requiring particular psychological effects. "Psychological effects, sir." "Fear, Chief. Pure, destabilizing fear." Winters's voice was matter-of-fact. "In certain theaters, particularly the Middle East and parts of Asia, the idea of being hunted by a woman created a unique psychological vulnerability we could exploit. Cultural taboos, religious beliefs, ingrained misogyny all worked to our advantage." Sullivan processed this information, connecting it to fragments she had read in her father's journals. "My father was involved." Colonel William Sullivan was one of the program architects, Winters confirmed, along with Dr. Eleanor Keller from DARPA and Admiral James Hargrove. They identified candidates with extraordinary natural abilities, then refined those abilities through specialized training that went far beyond standard sniper programs. "How many women went through the program?" Sullivan asked. 27 over the course of 2 decades. Of those, 14 were deployed operationally. Their combined confirmed elimination count exceeds 300, all attributed to other causes, accidents, rival factions, internal power struggles. No one outside the highest levels of command ever knew they existed. Sullivan absorbed this, her mind racing. "And you're telling me this now because someone has breached our security," Winters replied grimly. 2 days ago, a message was sent to every surviving Valkyrie operative. 3 have been confirmed dead in the past 48 hours, apparent accidents or suicides that we believe were actually targeted assassinations. The implications hit Sullivan like a physical blow. "You think the remaining operators are being hunted?" "We know they are," Reynolds interjected, sliding a file across the desk to her. "And we have reason to believe you're on the list." "That's impossible," Sullivan protested. "I was never part of Project Valkyrie. It was shut down before I even joined the service." Winters and Reynolds exchanged glances. It was Winters who spoke. "The original program was terminated in 1985, But your father, believing in the concept, continued let's call it an unofficial continuation. He identified promising female candidates and trained them using Valkyrie protocols, off the books. And I was one of these candidates. Sullivan's voice was tight with controlled emotion. The last, and by all accounts the most successful, Winters confirmed. Your father trained you from childhood, Chief. Every hunting trip, every shooting competition, every wilderness survival exercise. It was all Valkyrie training tailored specifically for you. Sullivan felt the ground shifting beneath her. Decades of her life suddenly recontextualized. What she had experienced as a daughter bonding with her father had actually been a calculated program of specialized training. The revelation was destabilizing, forcing her to question every childhood memory. "Who's hunting the Valkyries?" she asked, finally focusing on the immediate threat rather than the existential crisis. Reynolds opened another file. "We have indications pointing to a former KGB operative named Viktor Petrov. During the Cold War, he lost his entire special operations team to a Valkyrie in East Berlin. He's spent the intervening decades trying to identify the woman who killed his men. And now he has names, locations, operational details. Information that was supposed to be buried in the deepest vaults of our intelligence agencies." Winters's face was grim. "We have a leak, Chief. A significant one." "What about the other surviving operators?" Sullivan asked. "We're bringing them in as quickly as we can locate them," Reynolds assured her. "But several have gone completely off-grid over the years. They're ghosts by design." "And me," Sullivan met Winters's gaze directly. "What do you want me to do?" "First accept protection," the general replied. "We're assigning a security detail to, with respect, sir, no." Sullivan's interruption was firm but respectful. "A security detail would only confirm that I'm a high-value target and potentially endanger more personnel. Besides, I'm not exactly helpless." Winters didn't seem surprised by her refusal. "I expected you might say that, which brings us to the second option. We use you as bait." "Robert," Reynolds objected, "we discussed this." "It's her decision, Thomas." Winters cut him off, then returned his attention to Sullivan. "Chief, we believe Petrov is closing in on this location. Your sudden prominence due to the sniper training program has likely accelerated his timetable. If we control the environment, we might be able to intercept him before he strikes." "You want me to continue as normal?" Sullivan understood immediately. "Draw him out while your people watch and wait." "Essentially, yes. But I want to be very clear, this is completely voluntary. We can have you on a transport to a secure location within the hour if that's your preference." Sullivan didn't hesitate. "I'll stay, sir, but on one condition. I choose my backup." Winters raised an eyebrow. "Who did you have in mind?" "Lieutenant Commander Blackwood and Master Sergeant O'Neill." Reynolds looked skeptical. "Blackwood? He's capable, but he's not counterintelligence trained." "He doesn't need to be," Sullivan replied. "He's a sniper, a good one. And more importantly, Petrov won't be watching for him. He'll be fixated on me." Winters considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Your operation, your call, Chief. But time is critical. Petrov could be in position already." As if to punctuate his warning, a muffled explosion rocked the building, the shock wave rattling the windows in their frames. Alarms began blaring throughout the base. "Or he could be making his move now," Sullivan said grimly, already on her feet. "Permission to respond, sir." "Granted," both Reynolds and Winters replied in unison. Sullivan was out the door before they could say another word. The hunter becoming the hunted. The explosion had originated in the armory adjacent to the firing range, A calculated strike designed to create maximum chaos with minimal casualties. As Sullivan sprinted across the base, she could see thick black smoke rising from the burning building. Fire crews were already responding, and base security personnel were establishing a perimeter. Her mind raced, analyzing the attack from Petrov's perspective. The armory wasn't the target. It was a diversion. If she were planning the operation, she would use the confusion to mask her true objective, either infiltration or creating a sniper's perch with good sightlines to key areas of the base. She changed direction, heading not toward the fire, but toward the high ground that overlooked the main administrative complex. There was an abandoned water tower on the eastern perimeter that would provide excellent fields of fire to multiple high-value targets, including Colonel Reynolds's office. As she ran, she keyed her radio. "Blackwood, this is Sullivan. Do you copy?" A burst of static. Then, "Sullivan, Blackwood here. What the hell is going on?" "We're under attack," she replied tersely. "I need you at the old water tower on the east perimeter. Approach with extreme caution, likely a hostile sniper position. Bring your kit." "Roger that. ETA 4 minutes." She switched channels. "O'Neill Sullivan, respond." "O'Neill here, already at the armory fire. It's a diversion, isn't it?" "Affirmative. I need you to coordinate with base security. Lock down all exit points. We're looking for a single operator, likely male Eastern European, late 50s to early 60s. Consider armed and extremely dangerous." "Copy that. Be careful, Ghost 7. The use of her old call sign startled her momentarily, but she pushed the reaction aside. There would be time for questions later if they survived. She approached the water tower cautiously, using the scattered buildings for cover. The structure loomed against the morning sky, its metal legs rusty and its tank bearing the faded logo of the U.S. Navy. The access ladder was on the far side, which meant circling around through an exposed area, a risk she would have to take. As she prepared to make her move, a voice called out from nearby. "I wouldn't if I were you, Chief Sullivan." The voice was male, heavily accented Russian, but with the polish of someone who had spent significant time in the West. Sullivan froze, then slowly turned to face the speaker. Viktor Petrov stood 30 yards away, his posture relaxed but alert. He was tall and lean, with close-cropped silver hair, and the weathered face of a man who had spent decades in harsh conditions. He wore simple civilian clothes, dark pants, and a gray windbreaker that could easily conceal a weapon. "Mr. Petrov," Sullivan acknowledged, keeping her own hands visible. "I was expecting to meet you under different circumstances." A thin smile creased Petrov's face. "At the end of your rifle scope, perhaps. That would be your preference, I imagine." "Something like that," she agreed. "Though I have to say this direct approach is surprisingly bold for a man of your experience. Sometimes the direct approach is the last thing the enemy expects." Petrov's eyes were cold and calculating. "Besides, I wanted to see you up close, to look into the eyes of William Sullivan's daughter, the last Valkyrie." Sullivan felt a chill at the casual mention of her father. "You seem to know a lot about me." "I've spent 30 years learning everything there is to know about the Valkyrie program," Petrov replied, "including your father's role in creating it and his decision to continue the training through you after the official program was terminated. If you know so much, then you know I wasn't involved in whatever happened to your team in Berlin," Sullivan countered, trying to buy time. Blackwood would be arriving soon, and she needed to keep Petrov talking. "Not directly, no," Petrov acknowledged. "That was Valkyrie 4 Diana Harper. She eliminated my entire team in less than 2 minutes." His face darkened with the memory. "I alone survived, though not unscathed." He pulled back his sleeve to reveal a deeply scarred forearm. "Her final shot. I moved at the last second. It merely took my arm instead of my heart." "I'm sorry for your loss," Sullivan said, and meant it. But that was a different time, a different war. Those responsible are long gone. Not all of them. Petrov's voice hardened. Your father designed the program, trained the women who became living weapons, and when the official program ended, he continued his work through you. You've already killed 3 of the original Valkyries, Sullivan noted. Isn't that enough? It's not vengeance I seek, Chief, Petrov said, his expression thoughtful rather than malicious. It's completion. I'm a professional like you. When I start a mission, I finish it. The Valkyries were a threat that should never have existed, women trained to exploit our most basic cultural vulnerabilities. Your father understood this psychological dimension of warfare perfectly. As he spoke, Sullivan detected movement behind him, Blackwood approaching silently, his rifle ready. She needed to keep Petrov's attention fixed on her. "How did you find us?" she asked. The program records were buried deeper than most nuclear launch codes. They were, Petrov agreed. Until your government decided to digitize its archives. Even the most secure systems have vulnerabilities if you're patient enough. And the explosion at the armory, what was the point? Confusion. Distraction. Petrov shrugged. I needed to flush you out, to separate you from your protectors. It worked perfectly, as you can see. Not perfectly, came Blackwood's voice as he stepped into view, his rifle trained on Petrov's head. Hands where I can see them now. Petrov didn't seem surprised by Blackwood's arrival. If anything, he appeared amused. Ah, the loyal student comes to defend his teacher. How touching. I won't ask again, Blackwood warned, his voice steady. You Americans, Petrov sighed. Always so dramatic. Slowly, he raised his hands. There, satisfied. On your knees, Blackwood ordered, advancing carefully. As Petrov began to comply, Sullivan saw it, the slight shift in his posture, the tension in his right shoulder, the calculated look in his eyes. He was about to make a move. Blackwood down! She shouted, already diving for cover as Petrov's hand emerged from his jacket with a small pistol. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Sullivan felt the burn of a bullet grazing her left arm as she hit the ground. Blackwood had fired as well, his shot catching Petrov in the shoulder and spinning him around. The Russian staggered but didn't fall. With remarkable speed, for a man his age, he sprinted toward the cover of a nearby maintenance shed. Stay down, Blackwood called to Sullivan as he moved to pursue. No, she countermanded. He's trying to separate us. That's what he wants. But Blackwood was already in motion, advancing in tactical formation, his training overriding caution. Sullivan cursed under her breath and followed, keeping to a parallel path that would allow her to provide covering fire if needed. Petrov had disappeared into the maze of small buildings that dotted this section of the base. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that base security was responding to the gunfire. Time was running short for all of them. Sullivan keyed her radio. O'Neill, this is Sullivan. Petrov is on foot, heading southeast through the maintenance area. Blackwood is in pursuit. I'm flanking east. We need containment now. Copy that, O'Neill responded. Security teams are converging on your position. Be advised, they've been instructed to treat all non-uniformed personnel as hostile. Sullivan glanced down at her civilian attire, the same clothes she'd worn for the morning's training session. Acknowledge the risk. Sullivan out. She moved quickly but cautiously, using the skills honed over decades of operational experience. Unlike Blackwood, who was tracking Petrov directly, Sullivan was thinking like her quarry, anticipating his next move, predicting his escape route. The maintenance area opened onto a secondary perimeter road that led to a rarely used gate. If Petrov had done his homework, and Sullivan had no doubt he would know this was the weakest point in the base's security. She cut through an equipment yard, vaulted a low fence, and emerged onto the perimeter road 30 yards ahead of where she expected Petrov to appear. Taking up position behind a concrete drainage culvert, she readied her sidearm and waited. Seconds later, Petrov emerged from between two buildings, moving with the controlled urgency of a professional operator. His right arm hung awkwardly. Blackwood's shot had done some damage. But he still gripped his pistol in his left hand. Sullivan had a clear shot, but she hesitated. Despite everything, despite the threat he posed, there was a part of her that recognized in Petrov a mirror image, a professional doing what professionals do, a soldier following orders that had outlived their relevance. "It's over, Petrov," she called, revealing her position. "Base is locked down. Nowhere to run." The Russian stopped, turning toward her voice, his expression a mixture of pain and grim determination. "It's never over, Chief. Not for people like us." "The war is long over," she insisted. "Whatever happened in Berlin, whatever my father's role in it, it's history." "Is it?" Petrov challenged. "Or do the ghosts still haunt you at night? Do you see the faces of those you've eliminated? Do you hear their final breaths?" He took a step toward her. "We are the same, you and I. Products of a conflict that consumed our lives and left us with nothing but our skills and our ghosts." Sullivan kept her weapon trained on him, but his words struck a chord she couldn't deny. "Put down the gun, Petrov. There's been enough death." For a moment, it seemed he might comply. Then his eyes hardened. "I have my mission, Chief, as you have yours." He raised his pistol with surprising speed. Sullivan fired twice, center mass. Petrov staggered backward, his own shot going wide. He looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his chest with an expression of mild surprise. "Well played, Valkyrie," he murmured, and then collapsed to the ground. Sullivan approached cautiously, kicking his weapon away, before checking for a pulse. There was none. Viktor Petrov, the last ghost of the Cold War, was finally at peace. Blackwood arrived moments later, breathing hard from his pursuit. He took in the scene with a professional's eye, then looked at Sullivan. "You good?" She nodded, holstering her weapon. "Flesh wound, I'll live." The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of base security. Questions would be asked, reports would be filed. The official story would bear only a passing resemblance to the truth. As they waited, Blackwood studied her with new understanding. "Ghost 7, he said quietly. "That's what O'Neill called you on the radio." Sullivan met his gaze steadily. "Another life, another war. But the same warrior," he observed, "the last Valkyrie." She considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "No, just a soldier who did her duty, like my father before me, like you." The security vehicles pulled up, and the moment of quiet understanding between them passed. But something had changed. In Blackwood's eyes, Sullivan saw not just respect, but recognition, one professional acknowledging another without reservation or qualification. The lesson she had begun teaching him on the firing range was complete. It had never really been about wind reading or marksmanship or even tactical awareness. It had been about seeing beyond assumptions, beyond prejudice, to the true measure of a warrior's worth. As the security team surrounded them, Blackwood stood at her side, a silent statement of solidarity. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as man and woman, not as senior and junior, but as equals forged in the crucible of shared understanding. The ghost of Coronado had found her rightful place at last. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. In a secure room deep within the Naval Special Warfare Command building, Catherine Sullivan recounted every detail of her confrontation with Viktor Petrov, while three stone-faced intelligence officers and Colonel Reynolds listened without interruption. The only concession to her flesh wound was a field dressing hastily applied by a corpsman before she was whisked away from the scene. "And you're certain Petrov mentioned digitized archives?" one of the intelligence officers asked, his voice betraying the first hint of emotion concern that any of them had shown. His exact words were, "Even the most secure systems have vulnerabilities if you're patient enough," Sullivan confirmed. He implied that the conversion of paper records to digital formats created an opportunity for intrusion. The three officers exchanged glances. The most senior among them, a gray-haired woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions, leaned forward. "Chief Sullivan, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," she said, her voice low and measured. "3 weeks ago, we detected an intrusion in a classified database containing Cold War operational records. The breach was sophisticated, nearly undetectable. By the time we identified it, the damage was done." Project Valkyrie's files were accessed, Sullivan concluded, "along with dozens of other black programs," the woman confirmed. "We've been racing to contain the fallout to protect assets and operators who might be compromised. Petrov was just one threat among many that were activated when those files leaked." Colonel Reynolds, who had remained silent throughout most of the debriefing, finally spoke. "Which means this isn't over." "No," the senior intelligence officer agreed. "It's just beginning." Sullivan absorbed this information, feeling the weight of it settle over her already exhausted body. "The other Valkyries, the ones Petrov hadn't reached yet, are they secure?" "Those we could locate, yes," the woman replied. "But there are still 3 we haven't been able to find, women who went completely off-grid after their service ended." "I need names," Sullivan said. It wasn't a request. The intelligence officers exchanged glances again. "That's not your concern, Chief," the senior woman replied. "Your role in this matter is concluded. We appreciate your service, but specialized teams are being assembled to handle the ongoing threats." Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. "With all due respect, ma'am, I am uniquely qualified for this mission. I have operational experience, intimate knowledge of Valkyrie training protocols, and a personal connection that might help convince these women to accept extraction. Not to mention the fact that you just eliminated the world's foremost Valkyrie hunter," Reynolds added, lending his support. "She's the right choice for this, and you know it." The intelligence officer's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in her eyes, a reluctant acknowledgement of the logic in their argument. "I'll take your recommendation under advisement, Colonel. In the meantime, Chief Sullivan is to remain on base and available for further debriefing." As the intelligence team gathered their materials and prepared to leave, the senior officer paused beside Sullivan. "Your father was a remarkable man," she said quietly. "Complex, not always easy to understand, but his contributions saved countless American lives." Sullivan met her gaze. "You knew him." A ghost of a smile crossed the older woman's face. "We worked together, Budapest, 1978. She offered nothing more, leaving Sullivan to wonder what untold stories lay behind those simple words. When the room had cleared, except for Reynolds and Sullivan, the colonel sighed heavily. "Well, that could have gone worse." "Could have gone better," Sullivan countered, wincing as she shifted in her chair. The adrenaline was wearing off, and her wounded arm was beginning to throb insistently. "You need medical attention," Reynolds observed. "What I need is a shower, a meal, and about 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep," she replied. "In that order." Reynolds smiled faintly. "Always the practical one." His expression sobered. "Catherine, about Project Valkyrie. Did you have any idea?" She considered the question carefully. I suspected something. There were patterns in my training that seemed too structured, too specific to be just a father teaching his daughter, and his journals contained references I couldn't fully decipher. She shook her head. But no, I never knew the full scope, never imagined I was part of something so comprehensive. Does it change things for you? Reynolds asked, his tone gentle. Knowing that your relationship with your father had this additional dimension, it was the question she'd been avoiding since the revelation, the one that probed at the raw, uncertain feelings beneath her professional composure. I don't know, she admitted finally. I need time to process it, to reconcile the father I knew with the man who saw his daughter as the culmination of a classified program. Reynolds nodded understanding in his eyes. For what it's worth, I knew your father too. Not as well as some, but enough to recognize that whatever his professional motivations might have been, his pride in you was genuine and entirely personal. Sullivan felt a sudden, unexpected sting of tears and blinked them away. Thank you, sir. Get some rest, Chief, Reynolds said, standing. Tomorrow's soon enough to decide your next steps. As Sullivan walked back to her quarters, the base around her seemed transformed, no longer just a military installation, but a landscape filled with hidden meanings and unseen threats. The familiar had become strange, the routine suddenly suspect. At her door, she found Lieutenant Commander Blackwood, waiting, his posture alert, despite the exhaustion evident in his face. Blackwood, she acknowledged, too tired for formalities. What are you doing here? Security detail, he replied simply. Colonel's orders. She started to object, then reconsidered. After the day's revelations, a little paranoia seemed entirely reasonable. Fine, but I hope you're not planning to follow me into the shower. A faint smile crossed his lips. No, Chief. Just making sure you get there safely. Inside her quarters, a Spartan arrangement of standard-issue furniture that reflected her preference for functionality over comfort. Sullivan found her go-bag already packed and waiting on the bed. She hadn't put it there. Blackwood noticed her tension. Colonel Reynolds had it prepared while you were in debriefing. Said you might need to move quickly. Did he now? She examined the bag without touching it, years of operational caution asserting themselves. And did he happen to mention where I might be going? No, ma'am, but he did give me this. Blackwood handed her a sealed envelope. Said it was for your eyes only. Sullivan took the envelope and turned it over in her hands. No markings, no indication of its contents. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander. You're dismissed. Blackwood hesitated. Chief, about today? We'll debrief tomorrow, she interrupted. Right now, I need to sort some things out. He nodded, accepting the boundary. Yes, ma'am. I'll be outside if you need anything. After he left, Sullivan carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 names and 3 sets of coordinates handwritten in Reynolds's distinctive, precise script. At the bottom, a simple note. These women need you. Go dark. Trust no one. Outside the circle. T.R. Sullivan stared at the paper for a long moment, then committed the information to memory before destroying the document, a lifetime habit that now seemed more necessary than ever. She took a quick shower, ignoring the sting of hot water on her wounded arm, then, dressed in civilian clothes from her go-bag jeans, a dark Henley, and a lightweight jacket that concealed both her injury and the sidearm she wouldn't be leaving behind. Blackwood was still at his post when she emerged 30 minutes later. Going somewhere, Chief? Yes, she replied, seeing no point in deception. And you're not coming with me. His expression didn't change. Colonel Reynolds thought you might say that. He also thought you might need this. He handed her a set of car keys. Unmarked vehicle in the south parking area, full tank clean registration, no GPS tracker. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. The colonel seems to have thought of everything. He said to tell you he's returning a favor from Kandahar, Blackwood added. Whatever that means. The reference brought a flicker of memory, a desperate extraction under heavy fire, a helicopter that appeared against all odds, and Reynolds, then a major himself, extending a hand to pull her aboard. One professional saving another, no questions asked. It means I owe him two now, she said quietly. Then focusing on Blackwood, what I'm doing is classified beyond your clearance level. If anyone asks, you never saw me leave. You checked my quarters at 0200, and I was sleeping. Understood. Blackwood straightened. Understood, Chief. Sullivan turned to go, then paused. Lieutenant Commander, Scott, thank you. For today. For having my back. Always, Chief. His reply was simple, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. As she walked away, Sullivan felt the mantle of her true identity settling back onto her shoulders. Not Chief Sullivan, the administrative officer, or even the sniper instructor, but Ghost 7, the operator who moved through the world's shadows unseen until the moment of decision. The hunt had begun again. But this time, she was hunting to save, not to eliminate. The last Valkyrie was going to find her sisters. Dawn was breaking over the mountains of western Montana as Sullivan's rental car climbed the narrow logging road. She had driven through the night, stopping only for fuel and coffee, covering the 1,200 miles from Coronado to the Bitterroot Range in just under 20 hours. The journey had been a blur of interstate highways and back roads, her mind racing with questions about her father, the Valkyrie program, and her own unwitting role in it. The first set of coordinates had led her here to a remote cabin owned according to the county records she had accessed from a truck stop in Idaho by one Margaret Wilson, a name that meant nothing unless you knew that the first Valkyrie operative had been codenamed Morrigan, after the Celtic goddess of battle and fate. Sullivan parked half a mile from the cabin and approached on foot, moving silently through the pine forest with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to be invisible. The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Sullivan navigated through them, becoming just another shadow among many. The cabin came into view, a sturdy, well-maintained structure with a metal roof and a covered porch. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a battered pickup truck was parked nearby. The scene appeared peaceful, almost idyllic. But Sullivan's trained eye detected the subtle security measures that an untrained observer would miss: the strategically pruned sight lines, the nearly invisible tripwires among the underbrush, the concealed motion sensors mounted in the trees. She circled the property, noting how every approach had been carefully considered, every potential weakness addressed. Whoever Margaret Wilson was, she hadn't forgotten her training. This wasn't just a cabin. It was a fortress disguised as a rustic retreat. Sullivan approached from the blind spot, a narrow angle between two windows where the porch roof created a shadow zone not covered by any visible sensors. She was 3 steps from the door when a woman's voice called from inside, calm and confident. "That's far enough, stranger. State your business or start praying." Sullivan stopped, keeping her hands visible. "I'm looking for Morrigan," she replied, using the code name deliberately. A long silence followed. Then the cabin door opened to reveal a woman in her 70s, silver-haired but straight-backed, with the weathered features of someone who had lived hard but well. In her hands was a shotgun, held with the easy familiarity of an extension of her body. Despite her age, there was nothing frail about Margaret Wilson. Her eyes, sharp assessing, took in every detail of Sullivan's appearance. Nobody's called me that in almost 40 years, the woman said. Who are you? They called me Ghost 7, Sullivan answered. But my father knew me as Catherine. The shotgun lowered slightly. William Sullivan's daughter. A mixture of emotions crossed the older woman's face. Recognition, surprise, and something harder to define. You'd better come in. The interior of the cabin was warm and surprisingly elegant, a blend of rustic architecture and sophisticated taste. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with volumes on history, military strategy, and classical literature. A fine landscape painting hung above the stone fireplace. The furnishings were simple but of exceptional quality. It was the home of someone with discerning taste and the means to indulge it. You can put your hand away from your weapon, the woman said, setting her shotgun against a nearby chair. If I wanted you dead, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Sullivan relaxed marginally, though decades of operational caution didn't dissipate so easily. Are you Margaret Wilson? To the tax collector and the grocery delivery service, yes. The woman moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. To the Pentagon, I was Captain Ann Richards, United States Army. To your father and Dr. Keller, I was Valkyrie 1. She offered one of the glasses to Sullivan. But you can call me Maggie. Sullivan accepted the drink, bourbon expensive and smooth, and took a cautious sip. I'm here because you're in danger, Maggie. I've been in danger since 1964, child, Maggie replied, lowering herself into an armchair with the careful movements of someone managing old injuries. The only difference now is that someone's finally noticed. Project Valkyrie's files have been compromised, Sullivan explained. 3 former operatives are already dead. Maggie's expression didn't change. Elena Vasquez in Florida, Catherine Mitchell in Oregon, Diane Lawson in Virginia. She nodded at Sullivan's surprised look. Just because we scattered doesn't mean we stopped watching each other's backs. Who got to them? A Russian named Viktor Petrov, former KGB with a personal vendetta against the program. Petrov, Maggie repeated, recognition flashing in her eyes. Berlin, 1983, Diana's operation. Sullivan nodded. He spent decades hunting Valkyries. He almost got me yesterday. Almost? He's dead. A tight smile curved Maggie's lips. Good. She studied Sullivan over the rim of her glass. But you're not here just to warn me, are you? Not when a phone call would have sufficed. I'm here to bring you in, Sullivan confirmed. You and the other surviving Valkyries, somewhere secure until we can determine the full extent of the security breach and neutralize any remaining threats. Maggie laughed, a sound both genuine and bitter. Bring me in, child. I'm 76 years old. I've lived through 3 wars, 2 husbands, and 1 particularly determined bout of cancer. I'm not running from anyone, and I'm certainly not going back into that world. This isn't a request, Captain Richards, Sullivan said, her voice taking on an edge of authority. This is a national security matter. The older woman's expression hardened. I stopped taking orders in 1985 when your government decided we were too dangerous to acknowledge, but too valuable to eliminate. They gave us new identities and a promise: leave quietly and you'll be left alone. She leaned forward. I kept my end of that bargain. Sullivan recognized the steel in Maggie's voice, the same unyielding resolve that had carried her through whatever missions Valkyrie 1 had undertaken. Direct confrontation would only strengthen her resistance. My father respected you, Sullivan said, instead changing tack. In his journals he mentioned a mission in Prague, said he'd never seen anyone keep their cool under that kind of pressure. Something flickered in Maggie's eyes, a memory, a connection to the past that still held meaning. William was a good man, one of the few who treated us as soldiers, first women, second. She set down her glass. He was proud of you, you know. Used to sneak photos of your marksmanship competitions into our briefings. Look what my Katie did, he'd say. Sullivan felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. I didn't know that. There's a lot you don't know about your father, Maggie said gently. About the program. About what we did. She sighed, the weight of decades settling visibly on her shoulders. What did William tell you about Project Valkyrie? Nothing, Sullivan admitted. I only learned about it yesterday. Apparently, I was part of an unofficial continuation. Maggie nodded, unsurprised. That sounds like William. He never accepted the program's termination, believed too deeply in its value. She studied Sullivan with new interest. So you're the last Valkyrie, the one who carried the torch without even knowing it. I'm not here to talk about me, Sullivan deflected. I'm here to ensure your safety. My safety, Maggie echoed, a hint of amusement in her voice. Child, do you know what Valkyrie 1 means? I was the first, the prototype. Before there were training protocols or specialized equipment or psychological profiles, there was just me, a woman who could shoot better than any man in her unit and who didn't mind getting her hands dirty for her country. She gestured to the seemingly peaceful cabin around them. This place has more defensive measures than most forward operating bases. The perimeter is secured with multiple overlapping sensor systems. The windows are ballistically rated. There's a panic room beneath the floor with enough supplies for a month. And if someone did manage to breach all that... She tapped a pattern on the arm of her chair. A hidden panel in the wall slid open, revealing a rack of modern weapons rifles, shotguns, and several handguns, all well-maintained. I've kept current with my hardware, if not my field operations. I appreciate your confidence, Sullivan replied. But there are likely more than one team hunting Valkyries now. Petrov may have been working alone, but the leak that gave him our information is almost certainly being exploited by others. Maggie considered this for a moment. Fair point, but I've survived this long by trusting my own precautions. If someone's hunting Valkyries, let them come. I'll be ready. Sullivan recognized the futility of further argument. This woman had spent a lifetime making life-or-death decisions. She wouldn't be swayed by appeals to authority or procedure. At least let me give you everything we know about the security breach, Sullivan offered. Names, methods, potential threats. Then you can make an informed decision. Maggie considered this for a moment, then nodded. Reasonable enough, but first let's take a look at that arm of yours. The bandage is seeping through your jacket. Sullivan glanced down, surprised to see the telltale spot of blood on her sleeve. It's just a graze. Maggie replied skeptically. That's what we all said. Come on, I've patched up worse in the field. As Maggie cleaned and redressed the wound with practiced efficiency, Sullivan noted the calluses on her hands, not those of a retired senior citizen, but of someone who still maintained a rigorous physical regimen. The woman might be in her 70s, but she clearly hadn't let age diminish her capabilities. Your father would have been about my age now, Maggie said as she secured the fresh bandage. If the cancer hadn't taken him. Lung cancer, Sullivan confirmed. 3 years ago. Cigarettes. Never smoked a day in his life. Doctors said it was probably exposure to something during his service. He never specified what or where. Maggie's hands paused briefly. There was an operation in Kazakhstan, 1977, a research facility that was supposedly developing agricultural chemicals but was actually weaponizing a dozen different compounds. William led the assessment team after we secured the site. Sullivan absorbed this new piece of information about her father, another fragment of the mosaic that was his classified life. He never mentioned it. He wouldn't have, Maggie said simply. That was William, Compartmentalization wasn't just a security protocol for him, it was a way of life. She finished with the bandage and stepped back. It's why he could train you as he did, I suspect. Keep his roles as father and handler separate in his mind. The word handler stung, but Sullivan kept her expression neutral. Is that how you see what he did handling me? Maggie's eyes softened. I see a man who loved his daughter and served his country and found a way to reconcile the two. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. The original Valkyries, we were selected as adults. Volunteers, all of us. We knew what we were signing up for, even if the full scope only became clear later. You never had that choice. And for what it's worth, I think William struggled with that fact. What makes you say that? Because he told me so, Maggie replied. Prague, 1980, after the mission. We were waiting for extraction, and he'd had a bit too much Slivovitz to calm his nerves. He talked about you, how brilliant you were, how natural a shot. And then he said something I never forgot. I'm giving her the skills to survive a world I helped create, Morrigan. God help me, if she ever realizes what I've done. Sullivan felt as if the floor had shifted beneath her feet, a physical sensation of disorientation as another piece of her understanding of her father realigned. He feared I would resent him. He feared you would see the manipulation behind the love, Maggie corrected gently, that you would question whether he raised a daughter or crafted a weapon. The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable, yet demanding recognition. Sullivan found herself at a rare loss for words, the certainties of her past suddenly fluid and questionable. Before she could respond, a subtle chime sounded from a device on Maggie's wrist. Her expression shifted instantly from compassionate to alert. Motion sensor, southeast perimeter, 2 heat signatures moving deliberately. Sullivan's training kicked in, personal concerns banished in the face of immediate threat. Friends of yours? I don't have friends who trip my sensors, Maggie replied, already moving toward the weapons cache. She selected a compact Glock 19 and tossed it to Sullivan, then took a Benelli M4 tactical shotgun for herself. Basement. Tunnel leads to a hillside exit 300 yards east. Go now. I'm not leaving you, Sullivan objected. This isn't a debate, Ghost 7. Maggie said, her voice taking on the unmistakable command tone of an officer. You're injured, and you have 2 more Valkyries to warn. I've had a good run. Now go, that's an order. And for a brief moment, Sullivan saw not the 76-year-old woman before her, but the Valkyrie. She had been a warrior who had faced death countless times and made peace with its inevitability. She recognized in Maggie's eyes the same resolve she had seen in her father's, in her own reflection. Understood, Sullivan said, respecting both the tactical logic and the dignity of Maggie's choice. But I'm leaving you better odds. She quickly outlined a defensive strategy, using the cabin's security features to create choke points where Maggie's shotgun would be most effective. Maggie listened, then nodded approvingly. William taught you well. She pressed a key into Sullivan's hand. Safe deposit box. First National Bank in Missoula. Everything I know about the program, about the other Valkyries. It might help you understand. Sullivan pocketed the key. Thank you, Morrigan. One last thing, Maggie said, her voice suddenly urgent. About Victoria Valkyrie 22. Be careful. She's different from the rest of us. Special in ways even the program directors didn't fully understand. Different how? You'll see. Now go. And remember, Valkyries don't die easily. We make sure the price is high. Sullivan nodded and descended into the basement, locating the concealed tunnel entrance behind a false wall stocked with supplies. As she made her way through the narrow passage, she heard the first shotgun blast from above, Maggie engaging the intruders with the same deadly precision that had made her the prototype for an entire generation of female operatives. By the time Sullivan emerged from the hillside exit, the brief, violent confrontation was over. From her vantage point in the trees, she saw two bodies on the ground near the cabin's entrance. Maggie was visible through the front window, moving with purpose, gathering items quickly. Then, the older woman disappeared from view. 3 minutes later, smoke began to rise from the cabin, Maggie implementing the final phase of their hasty plan, denying the enemy any intelligence that might be gleaned from her home and belongings. The fire would spread quickly, consuming everything. Sullivan didn't wait to see more. The second set of coordinates awaited, and time was a luxury she could no longer afford. As she made her way back to her vehicle, she offered a silent salute to Valkyrie 1, the woman who had blazed the trail that Sullivan now followed. The journey to Seattle would take at least 10 hours. 10 hours to process what she had learned, to plan her approach to the next Valkyrie, and to prepare for whatever threats might be waiting. The hunters had already reached Maggie. There was no reason to believe they weren't closing in on the others as well. The bank in Missoula opened at 9:00 a.m. Sullivan, having changed vehicles and altered her appearance at a truck stop outside of town, was the third customer through the door. The safe deposit box key felt heavy in her pocket, a physical link to a history she was only beginning to understand. The bank manager, a polite woman in her 50s, escorted Sullivan to the vault and left her alone in the viewing room with the metal box. Inside was a single USB drive and a handwritten note in Maggie's precise script. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't waste time on regrets or revenge, focus on the mission. This drive contains the truth, all of it. Use it wisely. Ghost 7. M." Sullivan pocketed the drive and returned the empty box, then found a small cafe with free Wi-Fi where she could examine its contents. The files were encrypted, but the password was one she recognized immediately: Prague 1980, the mission Maggie had mentioned the night her father had revealed his doubts. What unfolded on the screen was a meticulously compiled archive of Project Valkyrie personnel files, mission reports, psychological evaluations, and after-action assessments spanning more than 2 decades. Maggie had been thorough in her documentation, preserving information that even the Pentagon might no longer possess in such comprehensive form. Sullivan skimmed through the key files, focusing on the information most relevant to her current mission. The 27 women who had been trained as Valkyries had collectively altered the course of the Cold War, operating in shadows so deep that even most intelligence agencies remained unaware of their existence. They had eliminated key Soviet assets, disrupted hostile operations, and even prevented 3 separate incidents that could have escalated to nuclear confrontation. Her father had indeed been at the center of it all, not just as a trainer or administrator, but as the program's chief architect and most passionate advocate. William Sullivan had identified candidates, designed training protocols, and personally supervised the most critical operations. His belief in the program had been absolute, rooted in a conviction that women possessed unique advantages in certain operational contexts that men simply could not match. Sullivan opened a folder labeled Continuation Proposal, 1986, and found in her father's own words the blueprint for what would become her upbringing, a meticulously planned curriculum disguised as a father-daughter relationship. As she continued reading, she found evidence of her father's internal struggle notes, questioning the morality of his actions, expressing concern for the psychological impact on his daughter, occasionally slipping into more personal language when referring to her as "my daughter," rather than her code designation. And then dated just 2 weeks before the cancer diagnosis that would eventually claim his life, a final entry: "I have spent a lifetime in service to ideals larger than myself. I have made choices that others would condemn, justified by necessity and national security. But as I look back on my greatest achievement, not Project Valkyrie itself, but the extraordinary woman my daughter has become, I find myself questioning whether the ends truly justified the means. Catherine has exceeded every expectation, surpassed every metric we established for the program. She is, by any objective standard, the perfect culmination of decades of research and development, the ultimate Valkyrie. But she is also my child, my legacy, not just as an operator, but as a human being. And in recent years, I have come to wonder whether I robbed her of possibilities by channeling her so deliberately toward this singular path. If these words are ever read by anyone other than myself, I hope it will be by Catherine. And I hope she will understand that behind the program, behind the training, behind every calculated decision, there was always love. Perhaps not expressed as openly as it should have been, perhaps too often obscured by duty, but real nonetheless. She deserved a father, not a handler. I pray that someday she will forgive me for being too often the latter and not enough the former. Sullivan closed the file, her vision blurred by unexpected tears. The complexity of emotions she felt defied simple categorization. Anger at the manipulation, pride in the skills she had acquired, grief for the normal childhood she had never experienced, and a profound aching love for the complicated man who had shaped her life. What mattered now wasn't just understanding the past, but applying its lessons to the present crisis. She focused on the files for the remaining Valkyries, particularly Elizabeth Chandler, Valkyrie 17, and Victoria Hayes Valkyrie 22. Elizabeth's file revealed a specialist in urban operations, a woman who could move through crowded cities like a ghost, blending into any environment, adopting and discarding identities as needed. She had pioneered many of the close-quarters elimination techniques still taught to special operators, and had executed some of the program's most complex missions in environments where long-range sniping wasn't an option. After leaving the program, she had reinvented herself as an architect, specializing in high-security government facilities. Victoria's file was stranger. Much of it was redacted with entire sections marked Eyes Only Keller, referring to Dr. Eleanor Keller, the neuropsychologist who had helped design the program's selection and training protocols. The mission reports that remained described an operative with an almost supernatural ability to anticipate threats and perceive patterns that others missed. One report referred to precognitive capabilities before being heavily censored. Another mentioned Project Stargate integration protocols with no further explanation. Most intriguing was a note about the Beirut mission that had supposedly claimed Victoria's life. The official story that she had been killed during an operation gone wrong was contradicted by a single line in Maggie's personal notes. V extracted under Protocol 0, full identity suppression. Not even her own kind know she survived. Sullivan cleared her browsing history, pocketed the USB drive, and left the cafe. The second set of coordinates pointed to Seattle, specifically a high-rise condominium in the downtown area. According to the file, Elizabeth Chandler Valkyrie 17 was her next objective. The Seattle skyline glittered under a rare clear sky as Sullivan approached the city 48 hours after leaving Coronado. She had taken precautions during the journey, switching vehicles twice, varying her route, maintaining counter-surveillance protocols at each stop. If anyone was tracking her movements, they would find it difficult to maintain visual contact. According to Maggie's files, Elizabeth Chandler Valkyrie 17 had reinvented herself as a successful architect specializing in high-security government facilities. An ironic career choice for a woman who had once infiltrated and compromised similar buildings for very different purposes. The attack on Maggie's cabin had confirmed Sullivan's worst fears. The hunters had access to the same coordinates she did, which meant they were working from the same compromised data. It was a race now, and one where her opponents had already demonstrated their willingness to eliminate anyone standing between them and their targets. Sullivan parked several blocks from Elizabeth's condominium building and approached on foot, maintaining a careful awareness of her surroundings. Unlike Maggie's remote cabin, this urban environment presented different challenges: more civilians, more cameras, more variables to control. The condominium tower was a gleaming spire of glass and brushed steel, its lobby staffed by an attentive security guard and monitored by at least a dozen visible cameras. Sullivan had anticipated this and prepared accordingly, changing into business attire that would blend seamlessly with the building's upscale atmosphere. "Good afternoon," she greeted the security guard with a practiced smile. "I have a delivery for Ms. Chandler in 1702. She held up a slim portfolio case, empty, but an effective prop. The guard consulted his screen. "I don't see any scheduled deliveries for 1702. It's the revised plans for the Arlington project," Sullivan explained smoothly. "Ms. Chandler requested them ASAP. She should be expecting me." The guard hesitated, then reached for his phone. "I'll need to call up and confirm." Sullivan's instincts flared. The guard's posture was too rigid, his eyes scanning her too systematically. This wasn't standard security protocol, it was a stalling tactic. She glanced around the lobby, noticing a slight discoloration on the security camera nearest the elevator, a sign it had been recently replaced or modified. "Actually," she said, checking her watch, "I just realized I'm running quite late for my next appointment. I'll come back later or have the office reschedule." She turned to leave, every sense alert for the trap she now felt certain was closing around her. The guard's voice hardened. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay right there." Sullivan didn't hesitate. She was through the revolving door and back onto the sidewalk before the guard could emerge from behind his desk. As she walked briskly away from the building, she caught sight of a black SUV with tinted windows pulling up to the curb, two men in suits emerging with the purposeful movements of professionals about to engage a target. Elizabeth's security had been compromised. The hunters had arrived first. Sullivan ducked into a crowded department store, using the shopping crowds as cover while she considered her options. The direct approach was no longer viable, and she had no way of knowing whether Elizabeth was still alive in her condominium or had already been taken, or worse. She needed information, and quickly. Finding a quiet corner, she pulled out her phone and accessed a secure messaging app, one of several methods Colonel Reynolds had provided for emergency communication. Her message was brief. "Target 2 location compromised. Need intel on current status. Ghost 7. The response came 3 minutes later. "Target 2 not at primary location. Currently at secondary workplace. Sending coordinates. Be advised, hunter team identified as ex-Spetsnaz contractors. Extreme caution warranted." The coordinates led to a nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city, the headquarters of Chandler Architectural Solutions, Elizabeth's firm. If the Valkyrie had followed standard evasion protocols from her training, she would have gone to ground in a prepared safe location rather than a known alternate site. The fact that she was at her office suggested either a critical lapse in judgment or a deliberate choice to maintain her cover identity despite the threat. Either way, Sullivan needed to reach her before the hunters redirected their efforts. The office building was a modern but unremarkable 6-story structure, its glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun as Sullivan approached. She had changed again now, wearing the uniform of a package delivery service, complete with a padded envelope addressed to Chandler Architectural Solutions. The lobby security was minimal, a single guard at a desk who barely glanced at her uniform before waving her toward the elevators. "5th floor," he said disinterestedly. "Suite 5 on 12. The elevator ride gave Sullivan a moment to center herself, to prepare for the encounter ahead. Elizabeth Chandler had been one of the program's most effective close-quarters operatives. Her file described a woman who could eliminate targets in crowded environments without drawing attention, who could move through security systems as if they didn't exist, and who had developed many of the hand-to-hand combat techniques still taught to female operatives. Suite 512 featured a glass door etched with the company's logo, a stylized C that incorporated elements of a blueprint. Through the glass, Sullivan could see a reception area, and beyond it, an open workspace where several people were still working despite the late hour. She entered envelope in hand and approached the receptionist, a young man with fashionably styled hair and an expression of barely concealed impatience at the late delivery. "Package for Elizabeth Chandler," Sullivan said, keeping her voice neutral. "Miss Chandler is in a meeting," the receptionist replied. "I can take that for her." Sullivan shook her head. "Sorry, needs a direct signature. Security protocol." She glanced at her watch. "I can wait a few minutes if she's almost done." The receptionist sighed dramatically. "Let me check." He picked up his phone and dialed an extension. "Ms. Chandler, there's a courier here with a package requiring your signature." He paused, listening. "Yes, I explained that, but apparently it's some kind of security thing." Another pause. "All right, I'll send her back." He hung up and fixed Sullivan with a resigned look. "Conference room C, end of the hall, on the left. Don't interrupt if they're in the middle of something." Sullivan nodded her thanks and followed the directions, her senses heightened with each step. The hallway was quiet, the ambient noise of the office fading behind her. Conference room C had a frosted glass door light spilling from beneath it. She knocked once, then entered, without waiting for a response, a calculated risk, but one that would give her the momentary advantage of surprise if needed. The room contained a long table surrounded by ergonomic chairs, a state-of-the-art presentation system, and a single occupant, a slender woman in her 60s, with short silver hair, and the poised, alert posture of someone who had never truly left the field behind. She was examining architectural blueprints spread across the table, but her attention had shifted to the door the instant Sullivan entered. "Elizabeth Chandler?" Sullivan asked, though she already knew the answer. The woman's eyes, sharp, assessing missing nothing, took in Sullivan's delivery uniform, the envelope, and the careful way she held herself that no civilian would recognize as a combat-ready stance. "Who's asking?" Her voice was cool, controlled, with the faintest trace of a Boston accent that her years of specialized accent elimination training hadn't quite erased. Sullivan closed the door behind her. "Ghost 7, she said quietly. "I believe we have mutual acquaintances." Elizabeth's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a recognition, a calculation. Her right hand moved slightly, positioning itself closer to what Sullivan suspected was a concealed weapon. "Prove it." "Project Valkyrie," Sullivan replied. "You were 17. Artemis. Specialized in urban operations. Your final mission was in East Berlin, 1984. Target was a GRU colonel named Baranov." A flicker of surprise crossed Elizabeth's face, quickly masked. "That information is classified." "Not anymore," Sullivan said grimly. "The files have been compromised. Maggie Wilson is dead. Elena Vasquez, Catherine Mitchell, and Diane Lawson as well. You're being hunted, Elizabeth." For a long moment, Elizabeth remained perfectly still, processing the information. Then, with deliberate movements, she reached beneath the conference table and produced a sleek Sig Sauer pistol, which she placed on the table before her, not pointing at Sullivan, but readily available. "William Sullivan's daughter," she said, finally, recognition dawning. "The one he trained personally." Sullivan nodded. I'm here to extract you. There's a team of ex-Spetsnaz contractors at your condominium right now. It's only a matter of time before they track you here." Elizabeth's laugh was soft and without humor. "Spetsnaz? How fitting. I killed 4 of their predecessors in Moscow in '81. She studied Sullivan with new intensity. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm offering you a choice that the hunters won't," Sullivan replied evenly. "And because Maggie trusted me enough to give me this." She carefully removed the USB drive from her pocket and placed it on the table. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly at the sight. "Maggie's insurance policy. She told me about it years ago, but I never thought—" She trailed off, then refocused on Sullivan. "You said she's dead." "She went out on her terms, took at least 2 of them with her." "That sounds like Morrigan," Elizabeth said, a hint of respect coloring her voice. She sighed, decision made. "How do we proceed?" "We leave now," Sullivan replied. "I have transport arranged. Once we're clear, we'll rendezvous with the 3rd Valkyrie on our list and proceed to a secure location." Elizabeth nodded, slipping the pistol into a concealed holster beneath her tailored jacket. "I have go bags in my private office and in my car. Habits die hard." "Habits keep you alive," Sullivan corrected. A tight smile crossed Elizabeth's face. "Your father used to say the same thing." She stood smoothing her jacket with practiced poise. "I have a secondary exit through the building's service corridor. Less surveillance." "Lead the way," Sullivan agreed. As they moved through the office, Elizabeth maintained the perfect cover of a busy executive dealing with an end-of-day delivery issue, nodding to employees, and even pausing briefly to give instructions to a team working late. Her ability to project normalcy while under extreme stress was impressive, a testament to her years of operating under deep cover in hostile environments. They had almost reached the service corridor when Sullivan's instincts flared again, a subtle change in the building's ambient noise, a shift in air pressure that suggested a door opening somewhere nearby. "We have company," she murmured to Elizabeth, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Storage room," Elizabeth replied under her breath, gesturing to a door on their right. "Alternative route." They slipped inside what appeared to be a supply closet, but was actually a spacious storage room filled with architectural models, drafting supplies, and filing cabinets. Elizabeth moved directly to the far wall and pressed a concealed switch. A section of shelving slid silently aside, revealing a narrow passage. "You built this into your office building?" Sullivan asked, impressed, despite the urgency of their situation. "I design secure government facilities for a living," Elizabeth replied with a hint of professional pride. "It would be negligent not to incorporate certain features into my own workspace." The passage led them down a short flight of stairs and into an underground parking area, not the building's main garage, but a smaller space containing only 5 vehicles. Elizabeth moved to a sleek black Audi and unlocked it with a remote. "My personal exit strategy," she explained, opening the trunk to reveal a comprehensive go bag and a small arsenal of weapons. "Old habits," Sullivan nodded approvingly. "We'll take your car to the extraction point, then switch to my vehicle for the remainder of the journey." As they prepared to depart, the heavy fire door at the entrance to the small garage burst open. 2 men in tactical gear rushed in, weapons raised. "Don't move!" one shouted in heavily accented English. Sullivan and Elizabeth reacted simultaneously with the synchronized precision of professionals who had trained for exactly such moments. Elizabeth dropped and rolled behind the car's engine block, while Sullivan pivoted and fired in one fluid motion, striking the first attacker's center mass. The second man got off a shot that shattered the Audi's rear window, before Elizabeth emerged from cover and eliminated him with 2 precise rounds. The garage fell silent except for the ringing echo of gunshots and the car alarm triggered by the broken window. Sullivan moved quickly to check that both attackers were down permanently, then returned to Elizabeth. "We need to move. Now. There will be more." Elizabeth nodded, silencing her car alarm with the remote. "The third Valkyrie," she said as they quickly transferred essential items to Sullivan's vehicle, which was parked several blocks away. "Who is it?" According to Maggie's files, her code name was Freya, Valkyrie 22. Sullivan helped Elizabeth into the passenger seat of her nondescript rental car. Real name, Victoria Hayes. Current location, a small town in northern Arizona. Elizabeth's expression shifted, surprise evident. "Victoria, I thought she was dead. After Beirut, they told us she didn't make it out." "Apparently, that was the official story," Sullivan replied, pulling away from the curb and merging into Seattle's evening traffic. "But according to Maggie's records, she was extracted and given a new identity. Deep cover even from the other Valkyries." "Why?" Elizabeth asked. "What made her special?" Sullivan glanced at her passenger. "I was hoping you might know." Elizabeth shook her head slowly. "Victoria was different. Even among us. We all had our specialties, our unique skills. But Victoria had something else. An intuition that bordered on supernatural. She could sense threats before they materialized, anticipate enemy movements before they occurred." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some of the scientists in the program wanted to study her, said her brain activity showed unusual patterns. That was right before Beirut. After that mission went sideways, we never saw her again." Maggie mentioned something called Project Stargate in her files. "Does that mean anything to you?" Elizabeth's expression hardened. "I'd forgotten that name. It was a government program supposedly studying psychic phenomena for military applications. Most of us thought it was nonsense, a waste of taxpayer money. But there were rumors that some of it yielded unexpected results." Sullivan absorbed this information as she navigated through the city, maintaining a vigilant awareness of any vehicles that might be following them. "Whatever the reason, she's next on our list. And if the hunters have the same information we do, she's in imminent danger." Elizabeth checked the magazine in her pistol before returning it to its holster. "Then we'd better hurry. If Victoria's abilities were real and based on what I saw her do in the field, I believe she's the most valuable Valkyrie of all, and potentially the most dangerous." As the city lights receded behind them, Sullivan felt the weight of the mission pressing upon her with renewed urgency. 3 Valkyries dead. 1 more found and secured. 1 still at risk. A woman with abilities that defied conventional explanation, hidden away in a small Arizona town under an identity so deep that even her former colleagues believed her dead. The road stretched south, a ribbon of asphalt, cutting through the darkness. 2 days of hard driving lay ahead, 2 days during which the hunters might be closing in on their final target. Sullivan pressed the accelerator, pushing the vehicle faster as the highway opened up before them. The last hunt was about to begin. The small town of Sedona, Arizona, was nestled among red rock formations that glowed like fire in the late afternoon sun. Sullivan and Elizabeth had driven for 36 hours straight, taking turns at the wheel, stopping only for fuel food and the occasional 15-minute nap. According to Maggie's files, Victoria Hayes Valkyrie 22 had been living here for the past 20 years under the name Grace Thompson. She owned a small bookstore specializing in metaphysical literature and maintained a low profile in the community, known for attracting spiritual seekers and New Age enthusiasts. Sullivan parked on a side street 2 blocks from the bookstore. "We need to approach carefully," she said, studying the street through polarized sunglasses. If Victoria Grace has the abilities described in her file, she may already know we're coming. Elizabeth nodded. How do you want to play this? I'll go in alone, Sullivan decided. You monitor the street. If you see anything suspicious, anyone watching the store, tactical vehicles men who move too purposefully, call my cell immediately. Understood. Elizabeth shifted in her seat, checking the sight lines to the bookstore entrance. But be careful. Victoria wasn't just good at sensing danger. She was also the best close-quarters combatant in the program. Better than me, even. And she wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a threat. Sullivan nodded and exited the car. She was dressed casually, jeans, a loose button-down shirt that concealed her sidearm, and comfortable shoes that would allow her to move quickly if necessary. She looked like any other tourist visiting the picturesque town. The bookstore, Pathways, was housed in a small adobe building with turquoise trim. Wind chimes hung from the covered porch, and crystals caught the sunlight in the display window. It was the perfect cover for someone who wanted to blend into Sedona's eclectic community. Sullivan paused outside, sensing something unusual. Despite the "open" sign hanging in the window, the store appeared empty. No customers browsed the shelves, no clerk stood behind the counter. The silence was palpable even from outside. She pushed the door open carefully, a small bell announcing her entrance. The interior was cool and dimly lit, scented with sage and sandalwood. Books lined the walls. Everything from ancient philosophy to quantum physics to tarot interpretation. At the center of the room stood a round table draped with a purple cloth. 2 cups of steaming tea waited there. "I've been expecting you, Catherine Sullivan." The voice came from behind her. Sullivan turned slowly, keeping her hands visible. The woman who emerged from the back room was not what she had expected. Victoria Hayes, now Grace Thompson, appeared to be in her early 60s, with long silver hair pulled back in a simple braid. She wore loose linen clothing and simple turquoise jewelry. Nothing about her suggested the lethal operative described in Maggie's files, except her eyes. Those eyes, sharp and knowing, had seen too much to ever truly forget. "How did you know I was coming?" Sullivan asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. A small smile played at the corners of Victoria's mouth. "The same way I know you've already found Maggie and Elizabeth. The same way I know Maggie didn't make it. The same way I know you killed Viktor Petrov 3 days ago." She gestured to the table. "Please sit. The tea is peppermint. Your favorite, if I'm not mistaken." Sullivan remained standing. "Is Elizabeth in danger?" "Not at the moment," Victoria replied. "The men watching your car are not hunters. They're mine former operators I've contacted over the years. Insurance, you might say. You have your own security detail." "I have friends who owe me favors," Victoria corrected. "And I've always been good at anticipating trouble." Sullivan slowly took a seat at the table. "So you know why I'm here. You're here because Project Valkyrie's files were compromised. Because someone is hunting us. Because you need my help." Victoria sat across from her, lifting her cup with a graceful movement. "But there's more. You're also here because you want answers about your father, about yourself, about what it all means." Sullivan felt exposed, as if this woman could see through the carefully constructed barriers she had built around her innermost thoughts. "Are you reading my mind?" Victoria laughed softly. "No. Despite what some of the scientists believed, I'm not psychic, at least not in the way they understood it. I notice patterns. I process information differently. I make connections that others miss." She took a sip of her tea. The military called it enhanced intuitive capability. Dr. Keller called it unconscious information processing. I call it paying attention. "And Project Stargate. A fascinating waste of government resources, Victoria replied. Though I played along, it kept me out of certain operations I wanted to avoid, and it gave me access to research I found useful. Sullivan studied the woman carefully. There was something about her that defied easy categorization, a calm certainty, a presence that seemed simultaneously of this world and slightly beyond it. Maggie said you were different, Sullivan said finally, special in ways even the program directors didn't fully understand. Maggie always was perceptive, Victoria replied with genuine fondness. Of all the Valkyries, she was the only one who truly saw me as I was not as what the program wanted me to be. And what were you? Victoria's expression grew serious. A mistake. A variable they hadn't accounted for. You see, the Valkyrie program was designed to create perfect operatives, women who could eliminate targets with extraordinary precision. But somewhere along the way, some of us began to question not just how to complete our missions, but whether we should. She leaned forward slightly. That's why they tried to eliminate me in Beirut. Not because the mission went wrong, but because it went exactly as planned. I eliminated the target, a weapons dealer supplying both sides of a regional conflict. And then I discovered that he was actually a CIA asset, that the entire operation had been a setup to destabilize the region for American interests. Sullivan felt a chill. You were going to expose them. I was going to quit, Victoria corrected. Walk away, disappear. But in our world, people like us aren't allowed to simply retire. So they arranged for me to die officially, while a few key people, including your father, arranged for me to disappear unofficially. My father helped you? Victoria nodded. William Sullivan was a complex man, deeply patriotic, utterly committed to his country's security. But he had lines he wouldn't cross, principles he maintained even within a system that often demanded their sacrifice. He saw what the program was becoming and tried to course-correct from within. She paused. That's why he trained you the way he did, not just to make you an effective operator, but to give you the moral framework he feared the official program had lost. Sullivan absorbed this, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. And now someone is trying to clean up loose ends, eliminate all traces of the program, including the women who made it successful. Yes, Victoria agreed, but not for the reasons you might think. She rose and moved to a bookshelf, selecting a volume and returning with it. She opened it to reveal a hollow interior containing a flash drive. This contains the real reason the Valkyries are being hunted. It's not about the program itself, it's about what some of us discovered during our operations, which was evidence of a shadow network within our own government officials and operators who used national security as a cover for personal enrichment and power. Some of those people are still active, still influential, and with the recent data breach, they fear exposure. The bell over the door jingled. Elizabeth entered, her expression tense. We have company. Black SUV, 2 men, tactical posture. They're setting up at both ends of the street. Victoria didn't seem surprised. Right on schedule. She handed the flash drive to Sullivan. Everything you need is on this. Names, operations, evidence, including the identity of whoever authorized the hunter teams. You knew they were coming. I've known for weeks, Victoria replied calmly. Long before Petrov found you in Coronado. Then why stay here? Why make yourself a target? Because some battles need to be fought in the open. Victoria moved to a painting on the wall, sliding it aside to reveal a concealed safe. She entered a combination and extracted a small case. I've spent 20 years preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, building alliances, positioning pieces on the board. She opened the case to reveal a satellite phone. When I make this call, a series of information packages will be delivered simultaneously to select journalists, lawmakers, and intelligence officials around the world. The entire network will be exposed. She looked at Sullivan directly. But there will be blowback. Some of it will touch your father's legacy. Are you prepared for that? Sullivan hesitated. Is there another way? We could run, Victoria acknowledged. Disappear so thoroughly that even their best hunters could never find us. But the corruption would continue. More innocent people would die. More operations would be perverted for personal gain. She paused. Your father believed that sometimes the right path is also the hardest one. What do you believe, Catherine? Before Sullivan could answer, Elizabeth's voice cut in. They're moving in. 2 from the front, possibly more covering the back. Victoria smiled, a calm acceptance in her expression. It seems our time for philosophical discussions has ended. She handed the satellite phone to Sullivan. The choice is yours. The activation code is Valkyrie. Sullivan took the phone, feeling its weight, not just physically, but what it represented. Exposure, truth, consequences, justice, and perhaps an end to the shadows that had defined her life. What about you? She asked Victoria. I'll buy you time, the older woman replied. Elizabeth knows where to take you, somewhere secure, where you can make your decision without immediate threat. I'm not leaving you behind, Sullivan insisted. Not like Maggie. Maggie chose her path, Victoria said gently. As I choose mine, as you must choose yours. She moved to the back of the store, opening another concealed panel to reveal an impressive array of weapons. Besides, I'm not planning to die today. I'm planning to send a message. She selected 2 compact submachine guns, checking them with practiced efficiency. Now go. There's a tunnel under the storage room. It leads to a garage 2 blocks away. Blue Toyota Highlander keys in the visor. Elizabeth was already moving toward the back room. Catherine, we need to go now. Sullivan stood her ground. This isn't right. We should fight together. Victoria fixed her with a penetrating gaze. Some battles can't be won with bullets, Catherine. Your father understood that. It's why he made you different from the rest of us. Not just a weapon, but a conscience. Honor that difference. Complete the mission he prepared you for your entire life. The sound of footsteps on the porch forced the decision. Sullivan nodded once, accepting both the mission and the respect for Victoria's choice. Good luck, Freya. And you, Ghost 7, Victoria replied, taking up position behind the counter. Your father would be proud of the woman you've become. Sullivan followed Elizabeth into the back room, through the storage area, and down into the tunnel. As the hatch closed above them, they heard the first shots being fired. Victoria engaging the hunters with the same lethal precision that had made her a legend in a program of legends. 3 days later, Sullivan stood at the window of a safe house in the mountains of Colorado, watching the sun rise over the pine forest. Elizabeth was asleep in one of the bedrooms, finally succumbing to exhaustion after days of constant vigilance. The satellite phone sat on the table, still inactive. Next to it lay the flash drives from both Maggie and Victoria, containing all the evidence needed to expose decades of corruption, manipulation, and unauthorized operations. Sullivan's phone vibrated with an incoming text. A secure number 1 she recognized as belonging to Colonel Reynolds. V extracted safely. Hunters neutralized. Decision time. So Victoria had survived as she had predicted. Sullivan felt a weight lift from her shoulders. But the colonel was right. It was time to decide. She picked up the satellite phone, turning it over in her hands. Activation would trigger a cascade of revelations that could not be contained or controlled once released. The truth about Project Valkyrie would become public knowledge. The shadow network would be exposed, and with it, aspects of her father's work that might tarnish his memory in the eyes of history. But wasn't truth the ultimate objective? Wasn't that what her father had tried to teach her beneath all the training and techniques? The importance of knowing not just how to complete a mission, but why Sullivan made her decision. She dialed the activation code into the satellite phone. Valkyrie. A computerized voice responded. Authentication accepted. Dissemination protocols initiated. Estimated completion time 6 hours. It was done. The truth would soon be beyond anyone's ability to suppress or control. Now she had one more mission to complete. 6 months later, Lieutenant Commander Scott Blackwood stood before a class of sniper candidates at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado. The room was silent as he surveyed the group men and women, each selected for their exceptional marksmanship and tactical awareness. Before we begin today's exercise, he said, I want to tell you about a protocol we'll be implementing in your training. It's called the Sullivan Protocol. He gestured to a display case on the wall containing 7 spent cartridges arranged in a precise pattern with a brass plaque beneath them that read, Competence is silent. Respect is earned. 6 months ago, this base was the site of an extraordinary demonstration by one of the finest shooters our nation has ever produced. Chief Warrant Officer Catherine Sullivan, operating from this very firing line, executed a sequence of 7 shots in less than 3 seconds, neutralizing an entire simulated enemy command structure at extreme distance in complex wind conditions with what many considered obsolete equipment. Blackwood paced slowly before the class. But the Sullivan Protocol isn't about marksmanship alone. It's about integration, the fusion of technology and human intuition, of science and art, of physical skill and moral judgment. He paused, making eye contact with each student. You've been selected for this program because you've demonstrated exceptional technical proficiency. But to become truly elite, you must develop something more elusive, the ability to see beyond the data, to sense what others miss, to make the impossible shot not through luck, but through a perfect harmony of skill awareness and discipline. One of the students raised a hand. Sir, is it true that Chief Sullivan designed the ghost scenario? She did more than design it, Blackwood confirmed. She mastered it. And then she went beyond it, setting standards that continue to evolve our understanding of what's possible in this field. Another student spoke up. Will we get to meet her, sir? Blackwood's expression grew more serious. Chief Sullivan is currently serving in a classified capacity that prevents her direct involvement with this course. But her methods, her philosophy, and her standards are now permanently integrated into our training protocols. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say due to security classifications, was that Sullivan was now heading a small elite unit tasked with monitoring and, when necessary, countering the very shadow network she had helped expose. The public revelations from the Valkyrie files had led to resignations, investigations, and reforms across multiple agencies. But some operations required a more direct approach. The Sullivan Protocol has 3 core principles, Blackwood continued. First, technology serves the operator, not the reverse. Second, perception exceeds calculation. Third, the moral dimension of a mission is as critical as its tactical execution. He moved to the weapon rack and selected a rifle, the same M210 that Sullivan had used in her demonstration. This weekend, we'll be conducting the first phase of the protocol sensory deprivation training. You'll learn to feel the wind, hear its patterns, and understand its effects without relying on instruments. As the class filed out to the range, Blackwood lingered a moment, looking at the 7 brass casings in their display case. His phone vibrated with a text message from an unlisted number. "How's the class?" He smiled slightly, typing a response. "Promising, but they're not you." The reply came seconds later. "They don't need to be. They just need to be better than they thought possible." Blackwood pocketed his phone and followed his students outside where the California sun cast long shadows across the Coronado firing range. The wind was picking up, creating complex patterns across the distant targets, exactly the conditions the Sullivan Protocol was designed to master. The ghost of Coronado might be operating elsewhere now, but her legacy was becoming something more powerful than a single exceptional operator. It was becoming a standard, a methodology, a way of approaching not just marksmanship, but the entire concept of special operations. As Blackwood prepared to begin the day's training, he glanced toward the distant hills that surrounded the range. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure there watching, evaluating. Then it was gone, vanished like a ghost into the landscape. He smiled to himself. The last Valkyrie was still out there, still protecting the nation that had created her, still embodying the principles her father had instilled. But now, she was no longer alone. She had created something that would outlast her, something that would transform the very institutions that had once sought to limit her role. The Sullivan Protocol wasn't just training methodology. It was revolution wrapped in the guise of evolution. And it had only just begun.